All right, it's 8:30 here on Wednesday, September 24th, and I think we're all set for our third workshop meeting for the Town of Orleans Water Quality Advisory Panel. I'll call the meeting to order and also call the meeting of the Board of Selectmen to order. The first item are the approval of minutes, and it's my understanding that the minutes, I think, were distributed, the draft was distributed kind of late on Friday. Recognizing that there's not been a lot of time here and there, what I would suggest is if there are any major items, changes, that Stacy should know about right now, this would probably be a good time in terms of corrections or changes. Otherwise, we'll formally approve these at the next meeting, give Stacy any comments that need be done. So are there any major items at this point? That, Stacy just totally ignored some great discussion that we had, or something of the sort. Is there anything major that Stacy should know about to be sure to start getting the minutes right now? Not see anything? Okay, then please give her your usual comments, and we'll formally approve at our next meeting. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Stacy and to Mike, who's going to be over there. Stacy, please.
Great. Hi, good morning, everyone. So if I can ask for comments, I know we always get a few things wrong at least. So if you can send me your comments if it works for you to get them to me by Friday morning, I can get it all turned around before the end of the day Friday, and then we'll have them finalized. But for those who are celebrating the holiday tomorrow, that might not be possible, so just let me know if you need more time. Ground rules, I can't remember all our ground rules, but for now, I think we'll stick with these. These should guide us for now. Please be respectful, and that includes turn off devices and such things. Be concise in your comments. Be on task. We have a very full agenda today, and we're really going to stick to that. And be constructive. I can add be participatory. If you have things to say and they're on your mind, please by all means share. Okay, so a couple of changes in just the order in the agenda due to logistical reasons. The overview of the 208 tools, methodology, and regulatory framework, which we had as our 9 o'clock item, we're going to have to move down because Paul cannot be here until 10, and he was going to do that for us. So we're actually going to take this bottom piece, the initial bookends. We're going to start with the non-traditional. So we're going to move that one up and just slide everything else down. So I hope that's okay with everyone, but that's what we need to do. So just to then give you the overview, we're going to start with walking through the non-traditional bookend, Orleans bookend. You got a lot of materials in advance. Hopefully you got a chance to look some of those over. They might not all have been self-explanatory, so we are going to walk through all of that. But it did give you a little bit of sort of the methodology and the justification for how these things were created. And we're going to walk through that and walk through by sub-watershed. So you really can look at all of these things, ask questions, and we can start into discussion. We're going to keep that last bullet, adaptive management. Still, we're going to move that to the end of after we've done all the other discussions. And so then probably at that point we'll do the 208 presentation, and we'll have Paul here to tell us a little bit about the tools that they have refined, that they're making available to Orleans for this process, so that we can use those tools and adapt them to our needs for this process. Also talk a little bit about where their approaches, their scenarios came from, even though we're not using their scenarios, we're drawing from them. A little bit about the approach they have in mind for how the towns or the local planning bodies should be working with these tools to move toward a hybrid solution that is locally developed, And then a little bit about other regulatory things that are coming out of the 208 that really impact the solutions that you all are coming up with. And then we'll move into the traditional bookend for Orleans. Again, explain a little bit where it came from, get questions and comments and discussion from there, and then we'll move into adaptive management. And we'll fit the break in there at around 10:30, 10:45, no matter where else we are. We all will need one. And then there was a request last time that we talk about outreach and public engagement. How do we get beyond the walls of this room? I was negligent in not getting an email out to you all during the interim requesting your ideas, so I'm sorry about that. Time flew. But we'll start that discussion here, and then we'll continue it on the next time. And we'll end with making sure we're clear on what we need for the next meeting, and, of course, public comment. And last meeting, we took comments or questions that followed the ground rules and were constructive and on point and all of those things from alternates and others during the meeting. We'll try that again. People said they were okay with that. If we need to refocus back into the group here at the table for purposes of time or efficiency, we will do that. And I'll make the judgment call on that if that becomes necessary. So that's our overview of agenda. Our action items from the last meeting, if I can find my meeting summary here. So again, we're still working on getting the PDF of the Microsoft project. There's been changes to the approach, so that's why that hasn't gone out yet. But that is going to be going out soon, Mike, the project schedule?
Yes.
Schematic?
Yeah. I'll talk about that later.
Okay. And then I think we have, we did the revision of the flowchart arrows. I sent that out to you all. The evaluation criteria list, I did make those changes, but I didn't send it all out, so I'll make sure that I do that. And the synthesis is in here, but we're working on an additional synthesis that might be more graphic on the S-curve. It sort of really shows what the group said you still need to get answers to, and what the procedure, how that's going to fit into the adaptive management. We'll start talking a little bit more about that today when we talk about the adaptive management. Any other questions about agenda, ground rules? Yes?
Last time you handed out this draft needs assessment, I have furnished a number of comments to Mike. I'm wondering, are we going to talk about this towards the end of this meeting, at any time in the future? How do we react to all this?
Well, your comments, I did get the comments. There weren't many. Yours did come in, Paul, and they were given to Stantec. As I recall, the comments weren't so much change this as add stuff to it, if I'm not mistaken. It wasn't like this is wrong or that's wrong or this is wrong or change this. It was here's some additional information.
It was partly that and partly the fact that this isn't really a critical review, it's just a summary
That's right.
of documents.
Exactly.
And we need to put some kind of assessment of which of these are valuable going forward and
Yeah.
bring things up in time. I don't want to delay your schedule here. I just think we need to have some time or some way to do that.
That's okay. Let me address that. I'm going to make some comments here when Stacy gives me the baton in a second, and I'll address that.
Any other questions or comments about the agenda or the action items? Yeah.
It's not exactly about those, but it relates. It is in my home computer. I can open these documents, but if I try to blow them up to a level where I can actually see them, I can't do it. How do we, I mean, I can't react quickly to something I see at the meeting. So how do we deal with that?
Good question. Solutions?
In that same regard, you just were kind enough to print out what I couldn't print on my computer, I can't even read this if I had a microscope. So I want to get into it, but I appreciate what you did, but it's useless. I don't mean to be negative. And some of my colleagues here with the poor eyes share my concerns as well as Sandy.
So some of the things like the screenshots are not really meant to be read. They're really to give you a sense of what this tool is, and we'll get more into that. So that's part of the problem is if you're actually trying to read it, obviously you're not going to be able to read it, but you actually don't need to read those pieces. The maps and the things you really do need to see. Even this is small, we realize, but that's why we did get the printout at least a little bit bigger. And we're going to, we'll do our best for those.
These are legible, these maps. There was one that I requested last meeting, and I think they're going to bring that the next meeting, because that was also not legible. That was in the report.
But thank you for, and we need to be thoughtful about how to deal with that, and maybe there's a way for us to get copies of things printed out in advance and left here, so that people can come and review them.
That would be great.
So let us think a little bit more about how to manage that issue. Anything else? I do have some other printouts of all of I did just a couple of copies. So if you weren't able to print them and you want them, again, some of them are not readable, others are. The charts and the documents with text are, so if you want one, just let me know right now, I'll bring them over too. With that, I'm going to hand off to...
Mike, welcome, by the way, to you all. My comments are outside the agenda, so I'll be as quick as I can, but sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. Someone once said to me, some words are worth 1,000 pictures. But I wanted to put in context where we are today in light of where we've been and where we're going. Put this up last time. The NEP nitrogen reductions are where we're starting. The 208 plant scenarios came out of the 208. We're trying to link to the 208. We do not want to replicate it. It's only a starting point. We're already past it. So it was and it is right happening today, a handoff. From that, we did a needs assessment. Paul's exactly right. It was a needs summary. We had the S-curve, which showed where we have confidence, where we don't have confidence, and what we thought was important and what we thought was less important. That's key. The CWMP was key in there. There were other needs as well that get factored in addition to the CWMP. The data comes from those other studies as well. Right now we're doing a tradition. We're talking about an Orleans traditional plan, and a Orleans non-traditional plan. That's today. That's where we are. These, Stantec's been working closely with the commission staff. Significant tools that the commission's developed have been handed off to Stantec. They're using those to modify the 208 scenarios. That's what you're going to see today. From that, we're going to go to a modified plan with technical assessments. We're not in the technical assessment part yet. We're not into the detailed nitty-gritty technical analysis of traditional or non-traditional technologies yet. This is a handoff right here. I'll come back to in a second. Same thing with the traditional, non-traditional. Technical assessments are going to come into that. The next few workshops, we're going to be focusing on those in detail. We have the watershed tracker, which we'll talk a little bit about today, that helps us do balancing, change coefficients, change costs, change whatever we want to adapt our alternatives going along. And a key piece, which is meeting this afternoon, is starting up, is the financial analysis, the model, that we want to get started early so we can use that all the way through this to put together a financial plan at the end, which is critical to this whole thing. From that, we'll get a hybrid plan. Somewhere along the way, we as a group need to recognize that the extremes all of one thing or all of another is probably not the right solution. So after we get the understanding of the traditional technologies, the non-traditional technologies, we modify them, we tweak them, we then sit down and say, okay, is there a plan? This is where the rubber hits the road. And this is somewhere in the December, January timeframe. Is there a plan here that takes the best from both sides and puts it together? I don't know what that is. Maybe it's very close to one side, maybe it's very close to the other. But we have to not just say that, okay, we're going to stick with one of the extremes and go forward. We need to be able to put together the optimal plan for Orleans. Additional technical analysis will go into that. And we got a couple of months to work with it, to modify it, to tweak it, to optimize it, to customize it, to continue to make it what we want. The point I'd like to make, we got these workshops here. We're right here now. We're right here. This is a messy step. This is going to be messy. Scott Horsley and I were talking before. He says, I told him that, and he says it's kind of like making an omelet, right? You got to chop up everything. You got handing a baton off. If you watched a relay race, that's the part where everybody can be fast on the straightaway, but it's the handoff of the baton that's the problem. And what we're doing here is we're taking a very general 100,000-foot planning work that the commission did, putting in ground rules, and we're bringing it down to Orleans. This is the first step, not the last. It's very messy. This is the start of the process. Don't give up. It's going to take patience. We will get there. We're going to dissect it. I said last time that it's very, very important. The typical process for doing a plan like this is to have the consulting firm come on, get up to speed, have a kickoff workshop. Everybody's happy. Consultant goes away, everybody's happy. 6 months later, a plan comes out. You have stakeholder meetings, and generally everybody's still agreeable. Everyone likes it. The plan comes out, and that's when the problem starts. 9 months, some CWMPs, that can be a year and a half before the problems start to set in. Costs come out near the end. You say, well, that's nice, theoretically, but we can't afford it. All that comes at the end. What we're trying to do here with this is put it at the beginning. We need to disagree at the beginning. This is the start of it right today. These alternatives, a nice word for them is straw men. That's a good word for them. Nothing against the commission. They were doing 57 watersheds all over the Cape in a year with a limited budget. They got us started. We don't want to go back and redo it. But this is not the end, it's the beginning. The work is just starting on these. We've got to get into the technologies, we've got to get into the key issues, into the things that Paul's mentioning that there's not clarity on yet. Maybe there is clarity, maybe there's not. That's something we have to talk about. So be patient, stick at the table. Again, this is a good day to be critical. Look at these alternatives. We got a lot to present. Stantec is a little bit of shock, I think I could say, because they like to put their stuff together. They like to do the work. They like it to all be clear. They like it to be polished. And we're saying, no, we don't have time for that. We're going to get it out there and get the main pieces out there, and then we're going to polish it as we go along. We can't leave stakeholder engagement till the end. It's been starting, it started now, and this is going to really pick up. So the stuff will be messy, but it's not the product now that's important. It's the product in March that's important. So bear with it, stick with the details as they come along, and I think this will work. I've seen it work in other places. Different approach, but this is the way we have to do it. So any questions or comments? With that, who's next?
I'll just reiterate from a process perspective, right? If we're trying to reach consensus, and we put that in our mission as a group, right? That we are seeking consensus, that's going to mean that you're not going to love everything that happens, right? Because we've got a lot of people whose needs we have to address. So Mike and I are going to do our best to try and balance, make sure that we're simultaneously trying to address the needs, and we have another master, and that is the end goal that we've all committed to trying to get to. So we don't sacrifice the end goal to meet everybody's needs on and on and on if it's moving us in the wrong direction, right? But it is going to mean we're not necessarily going in a straight line all the time. And we do appreciate the feedback we get when people feel frustrated, and we take it seriously, and we're still going to do our best to try and move us all together. So, okay, with that, we're going to move right into the non-traditional Orleans initial bookend, right? And so we'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, wait, sorry, I want to say one more thing. Around the room, in also not that easy to read font, are some inspirational statements. They came from the visions that people brought out at the last meeting. And we just thought it would be helpful that they were, they're created by the community as a tool for all of you during breaks or as you walk around before or after to remember what we're all here for. So that's what those are.
Thank you, Stacey. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for your attention. Gary McCarthy from Stantec, and we do have quite a bit of information to share with you this morning. Sia Karplus is going to be speaking to you about non-traditional techniques for wastewater treatment and management, and Steve Calabro from our group is going to be talking to you about the traditional strategies, and Lou Sirocco is going to be speaking to you about his newfound expertise in the tracker model that which are one of the very helpful tools that the Cape Cod Commission has passed along to us. Just a reminder, we are your technical resource on this project. We've been getting ourselves up to speed. We feel like this project is moving in the right direction from a technical standpoint. Mike is right. We like to polish things before we make presentations like this. So we're doing our best to make it to make sure that everything is as accurate as it can be. As an example, we just ran one last spell check on this one about 10 minutes ago and picked up one more. So if you see anything that's funky or needs to be modified, please let us know. What I want to do is you'll see these terms for the rest of the morning, and just again, we see ourselves as your technical arm, but we also see ourselves in a very as educators as well. The better you understand these terms and how they relate to the issue we're trying to solve, the better we will all be able to communicate that to the rest of the community, which is a big part of this. Won't run through every one of them, but we do have our non-traditional techniques, aquaculture, PRVs. You'll hear a lot about that as we step through. Eco toilets, inlet widening, related to dredging. And on the traditional side, which is the techniques that we typically see in a standard CWMP, and that's the gray infrastructure. It's sewering, it's pump stations, it's larger centralized treatment facilities. But it also does include clustered treatment facilities as well. So again, just trying to throw the terms up there, helping folks to understand those. By the end of this morning, I think you'll have a much better, a clear understanding of each of those terms. So with that, I will pass it on to Sia.
Morning.
Morning.
Sia Karpos, I'm a sub-consultant to Stantec and have really enjoyed working with them to pull together this information on traditional and non-traditional. I think Mike said it very well. This is a messy process. Traditional technologies collect and treat non-traditional, a wide spectrum of tools in our toolbox. And so I'm going to start out by trying to give us all a context for how the Orleans initial non-traditional bookend was born. The mission of the non-traditional bookend was to use no sewering options and come up with a way to get all the nitrogen out of the subwatersheds that needed to be removed. So it was set up as an extreme, a non-traditional extreme that involved no sewering. So obviously, it is not a recommended plan because it ignores a whole set of tools that might be useful. But as a way to begin this process, it was important to see what does it look like if you're just going to use these non-traditional tools to clean up a watershed, or in our case, 10 sub-watersheds. How did this start? What is this handoff process? I was trying to find an analogy, and I'm going to have to borrow one from Khalil Gibran. He talks about parents and children as a bow and an arrow. And in many ways, I think it's a very apt analogy for the 208 planning process and the preliminary scenario that the Cape Cod Commission has come up with. It's a bow. And what we've done with this Orleans initial non-traditional bookend is take that bow and shoot it. And now I'm going to present to you, when we get to the map, an arrow that's in the air. And that's this initial take at how do we do a non-traditional plan. And in the same way, how do we do a traditional plan? So we've taken the bow, we've shot an arrow, and honestly, you guys are the tailwind. The group here, consultants, us, we're the tailwind that's going to hopefully take that arrow and get it to a place, as Mike said, when we get to that hybrid after this messy process, where we're all really happy with it. So that's how we came to this, using the commission and taking it the next step. There's a universe of things we want to fix environmentally in any town, and Orleans, I'm sure, is the same. And in this case, we're going to focus on nitrogen. It's our initial focus. We've got ponds that are on the map and part of very much in our the forefront of our consciousness and our planning. But for today, we're starting with the coastal subwatersheds, and we're looking at nitrogen. But we'll get to the ponds, and we understand that there are 3 really significant priority ponds that we're going to look at in both of those. So that's a little bit about the context of this non-traditional planning and traditional planning. There was a process, a methodology that we used, and I wanted to walk everybody through so that we all understood what we did and how we got to where we are now. And the first step was to really study the Cape Cod Commission's tools. And I might be stealing some of the thunder in learning about those tools later, but there are some really fantastic tools that the Commission has developed. The technology matrix is one. And because I'm a stakeholder in the Upper Cape, Falmouth, I've been sitting at the table with the Commission for a year as one of you, I've been able to look at this evolution of the technology matrix from version 1 to version 40-something. And there have been changes in what the technologies are that are being looked at and how they are characterized in terms of cost and nitrogen removal. So those are the 2 big ones. We looked at those assumptions from the matrix. Then we took the tracker, the calculator, and the watershed MVP, which all work together to coordinate nitrogen removal values. So we're going to do a demonstration later of how this tracker works, but think of it as an accounting system for nitrogen. And one of the huge step-ups that those tools give us is, instead of having to go back to the MEP reports and do the math and build our own spreadsheets for how much nitrogen each sub-watershed needs, it's right there in Tracker. The numbers are there, and we understand then what our goals are. So we can start making our decisions about how to get to those goals. So that's the 208 information from the commission. There are some filters that we then went through pretty quickly to get to today. And those involve a bunch of ground truthing in Orleans, looking at maps, interviewing the Shellfish and Harbor Master Department, being able to talk to the Board of Health about irrigation wells and depths and soil types. Drove around and looked at the elevations of roads to understand how PRBs may or may not work. So ground truthing, I had a couple of great conversations with people who were involved in shellfishing here for decades. Sandy McFarlane, I don't know if anybody know that name. So she and I had some wonderful conversations, and she wrote a fantastic paper, 20 pages with a history of shellfishing in Orleans, 20-year history. And there is a treasure trove of real information about the ecology and the bottom conditions. So we took some general information from the commission and put it through a real filter called Orleans. And then, because I've been fortunate enough to work in Falmouth for the past 2.5 years, real demonstration projects, the shellfish demonstration, the eco-toilet demonstration, the PRB demonstration, innovative and alternative septic research, I was able to take some of that ground truth information from some real hands-on experience and also apply it to the technology matrix. So the commission's information filtered through Orleans, filtered through some real demonstration information, and then I had to make some value decisions. We had to make some judgment calls. What were we going to agree with? You know, we had to make that, and this is the beginning of that process, not the end. But just so we're all aware, we decided that the numbers in the technology matrix for kilograms of nitrogen removed for these alternatives are what we're using. So the numbers in the tech matrix are the numbers that we chose to agree with for the purposes of the calculations that you got on Friday, and I'm sure you all have studied, and that we're going to talk through next. I'd like to suggest that a very real possible next step is going to be to refine those numbers. Because ultimately, the amount of nitrogen we have to remove is there. But how good these non-traditional technologies are at getting us there is something we have to agree on. And I would submit that the technology matrix has good numbers. They're not off by a factor of 10. And they're probably not even off by a factor of 2. They're very close. There's still a range. And what I think an important part of this agreement process is going to be knowing when we have our plan that has a hybrid, has some non-traditional, and has some traditional, that everybody knows what we're expecting those non-traditional technologies to achieve. And we know why we believe that. And there's a whole workshop dedicated to just answering that question. But for now, the technology matrix. This is a little bit of review, probably for some of you, and a refresher for some of you. I'm going to go through these because the next step is to walk you through every watershed and the specifics of each watershed. So I want to make sure our nomenclature is understood and consistent. Permeable reactive barriers are, in our case, injection wells. We are not talking about trenches. They won't work in Orleans. The thickness of the aquifer is too much. So we're talking about injection wells, and what a PRB does is you take the flow of groundwater, you put a barrier of a carbon source in between the groundwater and your water body, and you create a situation where denitrification can occur. That's what a permeable reactive barrier is. It's adding a media that allows for denitrification. Floating constructed wetlands have probably been a curiosity, and I think with them a picture is worth 1,000 words. And this is an actual floating, this right here, is a floating constructed wetland. It's a substrate that you plant and things grow, and that's what they look like. And the reason they are so effective in such a small area is because you have uptake of nitrogen in the plants, and you create a root system where all this denitrification can also occur. Fertigation is the idea that you take nitrogen-rich groundwater and stick it on turf. on grass, on golf courses, at your ball fields. And so you've got this double duty of watering with non-potable water and providing the nitrogen the turf needs to grow. That's what fertigation is. Aquaculture, for the purposes of our discussion, is gear-based growing of shellfish as onesies. So the idea is you're growing from a seed, from a baby in an upweller where they grow at the nursery, to a full-grown oyster or quahog or scallop in gear without a lot of additional ecosystems around it. So they're one-lit growing of shellfish. The other extreme of that is coastal habitat restoration. And this is a picture actually of the demonstration project in Falmouth. This is a little pond, and those are bags of oysters growing. These are quahogs, kind of the end of the day, what your end product looks like. Coastal habitat restoration is the other end of the extreme where you really created an ecosystem with associated plants and animals and insects where shellfish also grow. And as far as the Cape Cod Commission's matrix, the nitrogen removal is still in the shellfish. That's where the numbers for nitrogen removal come from in coastal habitat restoration. But they're different because you're not growing them in gear, in floating bags or cages. Eco-toilets, everybody knows eco-toilets. This is a picture of an eco-toilet. They need no introduction, really. They're either urine diverting, that sequester the urine into a separate holding tank, or they're straight composters, that's a dry toilet. There's, believe me, thousands of paramutations that we've been testing in Falmouth. And I think the seminal point with an eco-toilet is it requires a plumbing change. So what you're doing is you're making interior changes to your plumbing and your bathroom and changing the way you interact with your bathroom. On the other end,
Words are worth 1,000 pictures.
when I took my first picture of a urine diverting toilet, I marched into a meeting at the DPW. I said, I just used a urine diverting toilet and I took a picture. Jerry Thomas, if any of you know him, just fell off his chair laughing. But that is the picture that I took. And on the other end, we have innovative and alternative septic systems, which, unlike changing the plumbing, you basically dig a new hole in your yard. And you put a new system in. And the beauty of that system is that it's designed to remove nitrogen. And so those are the two. So these are the technologies. And after I have a sip of water, you can all refer to pull up two documents, if you will. One is the bar charts that came on Friday, if you happen to print them out, mine are in color. But the bar charts compare directly each sub-watershed. We don't have them, I'll give you mine. This is just to refer to. The other would be the report that has the numbers on it. These all came as part of Friday's presentation. That's, for those of you that want the quantification of the differences in the 208 and the Orleans bookend, these are documents that quantify the differences. But what I'm really going to do today, you can see that, I can't even see that, is turn out the light. Maybe the lights will
Can't read.
You guys should look at your maps. I think I'm going to grab a map so I can actually talk to a map. Does everybody have one of these?
Yeah.
It's the Orleans initial non-traditional. And for those in the back, I'm going to try to have you guys maybe share a couple of these.
Sure. Yes, it is. Thank you.
Have that one. One more. Great, thanks. It's always, looks great when you're staring at your screen at home. Yeah. You know, I like the Well, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you on a whirlwind tour. First of Pleasant Bay and then of Nauset Harbor. I'm going to go sub-watershed by sub-watershed, and then after I finish with Pleasant Bay, I'm going to take questions. I think that would be the right way to do it, take questions and comments on these sub-watersheds. Good. All right, we're going to start alphabetically with Aries Pond. The Cape Cod Commission, I'm going to get down to Aries Pond. The Cape Cod Commission talked about coastal habitat restoration in Aries Pond, and because of our field research, we realized that there's already an upweller at the marina that's in Aries Pond, and a very successful volunteer effort at growing oysters. So it's a great program, and so the difference between the 208 plan and our recommendation is to really build on the momentum that's already been established for growing oysters in Aries Pond. It's a small pond. It doesn't need, it's about 140 kilograms of cleanup, and frankly, less than 2 acres of oyster aquaculture would actually get you there. So our recommendation for Aries was to continue with oyster aquaculture and not do the coastal habitat restoration that's in the 208. The other thing that we've done, and this is true at Aries, at Pawa, at Meeting House, we've looked at inlet dredging. There's an eye at the inlets in a number of these, and you can see it on your map pretty well. It's an eye with a red eye with a circle. The 208 plan had a threshold. If the Mass Estuaries report didn't identify inlet widening, they didn't look at inlet widening. And so in many of these terminal ponds, inlet widening was not recommended by the MEP report. However, it may, based on some initial research that we've done, be that dredging the inlets will increase the flushing and thereby remove the more nutrients. That's part of a technical analysis that we haven't done yet, but we wanted to remind everybody that it's something we ought to look at, because if you can dredge the inlet and get the cutting prism maximized or optimized to what it's supposed to be, that might actually give you some nitrogen reduction. So the eyes indicate someplace we need to do a little additional research.
So, see, I'm just going to stop you for 1 second on a process note. I think the intent is to walk through all of these sub-watersheds and then take comments and questions. If you have a really pressing comment or question, let's just say question, related to a sub-watershed, while that slide is up, or while that focus is, let us know. But otherwise, try to just hold them and we'll come back to them.
There are only 8 more in this sub-watershed, so we're almost there. 12 watersheds. Lonnie's Pond, Cascade Bend, is our next watershed, our next sub-watershed. And the commission talked about floating constructed wetlands, which are, as you saw, a very attractive feature. But when I took a deeper look at the actual sub-watershed, this line, this green line, is the sub-watershed line of Lonnie's Pond. Does everybody get that sub-watershed line? What I realized is that there is a road that runs perpendicular to the flow of groundwater near the pond that is honestly a terrific location for a permeable reactive barrier. It looks like you really do some yeoman's work, actually, at removing nitrogen. You couldn't have placed that road better for a PRB given the watershed delineation. And so instead of, this is our refinement, a PRB not coastal habitat restoration. I kept the coastal, the floating constructed wetlands in the pond as kind of the belt and suspenders approach, because there may be that a PRB can't go there for some reason. However, I think it could, but if it didn't, we could always punt to our floating constructed wetlands. Next on the list is Meeting House Pond. Now, Meeting House Pond is up here and has about 5 times the nitrogen removal need of these other 2 ponds. So we have to open our tool bag and dig a little deeper and not just pick 1 or 2 things, but pick really, it's sort of like the buffet approach. And the focus of the Orleans initial bookend and the 208 is using these natural systems to uptake nitrogen and create denitrification zones. So that hasn't changed. But I did notice another fairly fairly positive location for another permeable reactive barrier. So we added the potential for a PRB, and again, we've got inlet opening, inlet dredging, and the potential for maybe improving. There's a lot of muck in Meeting House Pond, and so we thought, sort of, at least in a preliminary way, about what would a dredge be an appropriate action for that pond. So that's one of our initial recommendations as well. From talking to the Shellfish Department, Harbor Master and Shellfish Department, there's a lot of predation of oysters that are bottom planted in Meeting House. I mean, 90% predation, like all predation, because of those bottom conditions. And so we are recommending this coastal habitat restoration, but not as bottom planting of oysters. It would have to be cohogs because they burrow down and don't actually have the same kind of predation that oysters do. So we've refined the kind of shellfish activity that we're talking about. Even with all those tools, there is still a mass of nitrogen left, because to be practical with the space that's available in Meeting House or any of these ponds, given the other conflicting uses that are there, you can only make things so big. So the methodology that we used for getting the rest, the natural systems can go so far. What we did with the rest is we took the number of kilograms and equally separated them into eco-toilets and IA systems. We just said 50% of the nitrogen is going to get removed by eco-toilets and 50% is going to be IA systems. The numbers, 42 eco-toilets, 36 IA systems. And those numbers are fairly interchangeable. And that's something that we really need to hear from the community about, whether eco-toilets are going to make sense for people or if they're going to be all IA systems because you already have so many IA systems in town. It's easy to have the numbers go back and forth.
Just a quick clarifying question. In terms of your assessment of the different alternatives, for example, in Meeting House Pond, have you taken into consideration dissolved oxygen levels?
No.
Because, I mean, they're extremely low.
Right.
Certainly at the bottom in terms of the effectiveness of coastal restoration or habitat restoration or the shellfish aquaculture.
So that's a very interesting point. In Little Pond, where we're doing the project in Falmouth, we have anoxic, we have sulfur in the bottom sediment there. So part of what coastal habitat restoration and aquaculture does is oxygenates. So I think, I haven't specifically looked at the low VO, but it wouldn't be a non-sputter, is I guess what my answer to that is. And I think that that's exactly the kind of feedback we need, so we should make a note of that anoxic bottom condition, because that may beg the question, should we be thinking about some mixing? So that's a great insight, and I want to break that down.
I just wanted to add that, add to what was really saying. Shellfish need a certain amount of oxygen in order to live. So.
All right, we're going to continue on. Namaquat's easy because, in looking at it, at least in a preliminary way, the idea of a natural aesthetic in that river seemed to make sense. So the 208 plan has floating constructed wetlands, those floating islands of greenery, and I thought that was exactly right. Pawa is another one of those sub-watersheds where a permeable reactive barrier could be very useful. Again, if you look at the watershed itself, which is this sort of triangle here. There's a road here. I think it's Herringbrook Way. That looks like it was designed to go perfect. It's not Herringbrook. Lockwood Lane.
Lockwood Lane.
Lockwood Lane. So Lockwood Lane looks like it was designed for a PRB to intercept the groundwater. And so that is our main recommendation here. I included some coastal habitat restoration because Pawa also generally, again, belt and suspenders. If the PRB didn't pan out, there could still be, because there's not a huge amount that needs to be removed, I mean, it's under 500 kilograms a year, a small natural system could also freeze up. Poaching is, there was the Cape Cod Commission talked about floating constructed wetlands in Poaching, but we had a great opportunity to meet with some of the folks who are working on Wellfleet. And Anna Maria Frankett came down, and she had also talked to the Harbor Master Department and looked at all the shellfish grants. And given the fact that there's about 13 active shellfish grants here at the head of Barley's, at the end of Barley's, and they're producing hundreds of thousands of oysters and growing millions of oysters, the opportunity to collect the spat or the set or the babies that come off those oysters through an oyster reef seemed like a really reasonable project to pursue. So the idea would be to create some substrate that the spat could grow on and maybe seed it, and think about the feasibility of a 3-acre oyster reef there, existing conditions being the driver for that. It doesn't get you all the way there because Poaching does have a fairly stiff nitrogen reduction goal, and so eco-toilets and innovative alternative septic systems would take the balance. Yeah. Three more to go.
I'm just looking at the picture. Mine says, if there's any substantial depth change with that reef, is it going to impact tidal exchange?
Navigation, too.
Those are absolutely the next questions. That's the technical analysis. This was, we're at 10,000 feet. We're not at 100. And I am very respectful of the fact that these have to be really, I mean, the thing about non-traditional alternatives is they are very site-specific. So we have to actually get in there before we figure this out.
I don't know the answer to this, but more and more aquaculturists are using triploids, which are sterile and don't produce spat, so that would be a factor to consider.
Yes, absolutely. I was actually thinking about that this morning. Like, are they using triploids or not? You're absolutely right.
I know some do on the Cape Cod Bay side.
Okay, good information. Quonset is another easy one because the commission and I both thought that floating constructed wetlands would make sense. It's a little pond on the bottom. And one of the things with floating constructed wetlands is they seem to have some tremendous potential. They seem to remove a lot of nitrogen in a very small footprint. And the first thing that Brian Doug is going to say is, well, do you have a demonstration project? What are 3 years of data, please, to show that this is actually real?
Do you have a demonstration project?
You could say that. And if we were going to do a demonstration project, Quonset would be a great location because you could actually look at water quality changes. So I kept the floating constructed wetlands in hopes that if this were a tool that the community did actually want to pursue, we could prove it out. And last but not least, we've got the river. We've got the upper and the lower river, and the commission talked about coastal habitat restoration in the upper river and floating constructed wetlands in the lower river. And when I took a look at it, having talked and read McFarlane's work, this was an area where cohogs were very successful. And so my refinement of the 208 scenario is really to look at coastal habitat restoration, aquaculture hybrid. The idea that you would want to look at bottom conditions, but then think about propagating either oysters as either a reef or as a bottom planting, or cohogs, because cohogs do very, very well in Orleans, and so it may be a matter of really trying to go with the momentum of cohogs because they're already successful here, as opposed to trying to bring in oysters, although there are reasons to look at oysters, and that's what we have to really talk about. But at this level, it's the idea that we would want to have some natural system that included propagating and harvesting shellfish in addition to just natural systems. And there, I've walked you through a solution for Pleasant Bay. And before I go on to Town Cove, I would love to hear additional thoughts and comments about.
So let's start with questions, additional clarifying questions. remember, the premise of this exercise is if you were to solve all of the problems with just non-traditional methods, this is not a recommended solution, just an exercise. So going from there. Next.
It's a comment more than a question. Well, it's a question and a comment. With regard to Lonnie's Pond, there are two hydro connections that enter Lonnie's Pond. One is in the watershed that you showed with the PRB, which is a physical pipe that travels underground. It goes from the Cranberry Bog on Monument Road, which is, the source water for that is Crystal Lake. It travels from the Cranberry Bog underground and comes out right near the town landing in Lonnie's Pond. The other is our historical herring run that comes out of Pilgrim Lake, which is just outside the watershed boundary that you showed, but it's right next to it. So you do have two hydro connections coming in.
Brian?
On the inlet widenings in Aries Pond and Meeting House and Hannaford and some of the others, are those currently occluded, artificially occluded, or would you be looking to expand a natural, beyond the natural condition?
They are currently occluded. There's been sedimentation. That was the idea to really, and I don't know to what extent, but the idea would be just to keep what's there, not to widen.
But is that occlusion naturally occurring, or is that as a result of any man-made activity?
And the relevance to the answer to that question.
Conversation.
A little louder, please.
Can't really hear.
Know what it was.
If it's an artificial condition, it's a lot easier to make a claim for, or to make a case for inlet widening. If it's as a result of natural conditions, it may be a little bit more difficult.
If I could follow up on that. All of Pleasant Bay is an ACEC, and the channels to Meeting House Pond, Catskill-Gansett, Aries, Pawa Pond, Quonset Pond, and the Narrows are the only places that can be dredged, and they can only be dredged to the dimensions to which they were dredged to in 1955. Now, and I have had inlet dredging in our capital plan in Orleans for a couple of years because it's something we need to look at. Pleasant Bay Alliance has done a lot of work on water flow in and out of those ponds. And the one thing I think that hasn't been done is sort of the hydrodynamic test of what would happen if you opened up the channel. Would it in fact improve the water quality?
Right, the data actually that keyed us in to the potential for this dredging came from a Pleasant Bay Alliance report. It was a consultant that looked at the inlet sizes, especially Meeting House.
Yeah.
I can't remember the name. I have the name of the report written down.
So
That was a baseline report that was done. It simply measured the current, well, at that time it was a few years ago, but they provided a baseline of depths in all of those channels.
So the other point that is critical is that those channels were all permissibly dredged to something like 3 feet at mean low water, and I believe the ponds range in depth from 15 to 20 plus feet. So you've got a situation where the water's coming in and out, but the tub is still there.
Yeah.
So just relating to that.
Okay, thanks. Jeff?
Yeah. At Muddy Creek, the bridge or whatever it is, the restriction that the highway department put in with the state highway people causes a restriction, and the plan is to open that up. And that's effectively inlet widening. So that's going to increase the tidal prism up into Muddy Creek. But if you're talking about dredging, that's not inlet widening. That's just making the thing deeper. And what you need to increase the tidal prism is a differential height. And I think when you go and open up Meeting House Pond or Aries Pond, you're not going to increase the differential, the difference between the tidal height and the pond height. You're going to improve navigation, but the tidal prism increase is going to be insignificant.
Yeah, if I could just follow up on the tidal prism, Provincetown Center, now Coastal Center for Coastal Studies, has detailed tide information for the entire Pleasant Bay estuary, from Meeting House Pond down to the fish pier, over the years. So you've got a good idea of what the tidal prism is, a good history of it. And I agree with Jeff on that issue, so.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, but we wanted to have it explicitly there so that we want to leave no stone unturned. And we want to make sure that we picked it up and said, that's not going to help us, and put it back down, as opposed to just, instead of this paragraph, this is saying that it's not going to work. So this is exactly what we're looking for.
Yeah, on in situ solutions like floating constructed wetlands or oysters, shellfish, aquaculture, reefs, and that sort of thing, the whole purpose of this is to improve water quality. I mean, nitrogen reduction is being used as a proxy, but it's not a proxy that guarantees improvement in water quality. It's a proxy, and we hope it's going to improve water quality. But the in situ solutions, particularly the shellfish solutions and reefs, have multiple benefits that do improve water quality. And they also improve sediment quality, and they have a direct impact on the water body, and an impact that's quite directly on a shorter time scale. And you will know that from your experience in Whitnall Pond in Falmouth, because that's exactly what they found there, and that's what they found out in Loveland.
So, and we'll keep in mind the additional benefits piece.
And that sediment improvement piece is what goes after some of these future bedded materials, the black mayonnaise, as Kurt Felix calls it. It's on the bottom, and improves that and makes the whole ecosystem, the whole water system work better, and enhances habitats for finfish and other creatures that live in there.
You know, if I weren't here, I'd actually be on Little Pond doing sediment course with nitrification studies right now. The guys at S-Master are out in my boat, and they're pulling the core so we can actually get that exact data under an oyster aquaculture project to see what denitrification happens in an anoxic bottom. So I can't wait for the results.
Can I make a quick comment here, if I could, just with a question for Jeff? 25 years now I've been working lakes and ponds, a piece of what I've been doing. In most cases, in my experience, the sediment is a result of eutrophication, and is a big nitrogen sink and nitrogen source. So while there are side benefits to aquaculture, and this is a question, this isn't the end, it's a question I'd have going forward. Cleaning up the nitrogen eventually has impacts on the sediment. So a combination of getting the existing sediment out of there, improving nitrogen, seems to me to work together. Sediment, nitrogen, and the black mucky stuff are directly related. So, is that wrong?
No, it's right, and the shellfish contribute to that sediment improvement. I mean,
exactly.
And it's a timescale thing.
It's a combination of things that could expedite the process as well.
And to expedite it, you need to do it in years rather than decades.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Just a couple of comments, and some of them have been touched on, but Alan mentioned the regulatory considerations, and I assume that you're just sort of putting that aside for a minute, but there would be certainly some issues with dredging in some of the areas because of the ACEC designation. I also wanted to mention use conflicts as something to be considered. Most of these areas are heavily used during the summer, especially for boating and other purposes. and especially in those small ponds. So just another practical matter in terms of assessing the placement of some of these facilities. And just to comment on dredging, part of the reason that the Alliance did not pursue any further study of, we did the baseline assessment of the entrance channels into all of those ponds, but the, technical input we received was that the volume of water exchange, as Jeff pointed out, really wasn't going to be sufficient to have an impact, and especially because you're not addressing the source problem, which is the water flow, the watershed inflow of nitrogen. So, that didn't really seem, in our view, to be addressing the problem, and really is also, it should be considered as a temporary solution because channels fill in again. And finally, and I think someone touched on it, the disposal of material is a huge issue, especially in those ponds. It's really, not stuff that you really want to put anywhere. So some sort of reuse or removal is an issue. And let's see, and Muddy Creek, I think that is a good point that Jeff made. And just to put this in perspective, I mean, the Muddy Creek widening, which is a significant inlet widening, will improve the nitrogen concentrations by about a third. But still, even in that instance, is not enough to solve the problem. And watershed solutions will also be necessary. And then finally, I know it's been touched on, but I just want to kind of echo the question of the performance and efficacy of some of these solutions and the lack of data. Apparently, I know you're using best efforts to look at demonstration projects and whatever's available in the industry, but I think it raises certainly a question from the Alliance perspective, where we've drilled into our minds, you need to have 5 to 10 years of data, to really know what's going on. That's certainly been the perspective on the water quality issues through our monitoring program. We have a lot of data on the performance of the traditional systems. So I think there's just an imbalance there, and I know that's something we're going to address, but it's certainly a question, certainly in our minds. Thank you.
And I just want to say, as we go along, we will certainly remember we created those evaluation criteria. And I think the regulatory, the use conflicts, the risk, all of those are in there. So we will be looking at all that stuff. It's fine. It's good to point it out, your considerations on those now. Remember, we will, homework, we will be looking at them. Paul, and we'll get back there, but I'm just going to get the table first.
You indicated 2 PRBs at Lonnie's Pond and down by Poa. And those are appealing solutions in the sense that they're passive. You put them in and they essentially run themselves, ideally. But I assume there is some maintenance over some period of time or replacement of the media or whatever. And we don't need an answer right now. But alternatively to those would be a cluster system for the immediate part of the watershed that would be interfecting there. You didn't show those.
Right, because this is the non-traditional. That falls into the traditional. So we'll get to that when we look at the traditional.
Okay, but that becomes a cost trade-off, both in the initial cost and...
That's why we will have the hybrid that will start to say, in this sub-watershed, does it make sense to bring in some of the traditional or some of the non-traditional, and in what proportion and why, and using the cost? That's where we're going.
Okay.
We're not there yet. Now we're in this hypothetical.
One last comment is, some of the solutions you proposed, are they vulnerable to storm activity? Are their service interrupted because of weather conditions? But I just leave that.
Judy, then Judith.
We may be getting to this later, as Stacy indicated, but with regard to aquaculture, there are a lot of issues that we need to consider. Primarily, they're living organisms, and a lot of things can go wrong, and they can die for a variety of reasons. And you have the environmental conditions to consider, such as temperature, dissolved oxygen. Predators can wipe out your entire grant. Epiphytes, both algal and faunal. Seasonality, a lot of people who do aquaculture pull their oysters in the wintertime for several months at least. So seasonality is a factor. You have silt issues, diseases. It's labor intensive depending on the type of aquaculture. You have navigational concerns, which were also mentioned earlier, and then the ever-present regulatory issues, local, state, and federal permits, et cetera. So I just put that out there.
Oh, yeah, following up a little on what Carol was talking about in terms of use. I'm not a boater, and I love the appearance of these constructed wetlands. But I also recognize that we've got an awful lot of boaters in town. And looking at Namaquoit River, I mean, I've kayaked and paddleboarded through there, and it's very busy. And if you're going to put a constructed wetland right in the middle of Namaquoit River, you're going to be decreasing the number of moorings. You're going to be impeding a lot of the channel for boating in and out of Aries Pond. Quonset Pond is loaded with boats right now. There's a 15-year waiting list to get a mooring in Quonset Pond. You're not going to put a constructed wetland in there without eliminating some of the moorings that already exist. So I think there's going to be a significant pushback by a number of people when we come up against how much, I mean, there may be, and we probably need to look at how much sacrifice of our use of the waters are we going to be willing to take in order to clean them up. And there's probably going to be a piece of that. But I think there's going to be a significant pushback when people start hitting up against losing their ability to get to the waters that they really enjoy for the sake of cleaning them up.
Right, and you know, it's interesting, because I did look, I really wanted to vote through all of these before doing this, just didn't have a chance, did Google Earth it. I have a sailboat, I have a Moby Cat, I have a powerboat. I'm very sensitive to boating, and in Falmouth, we have the same issue. We have 14 estuaries, most of them have moorings. If you look at the square footage of the floating constructed wetland, it's 26 feet by 26 feet, which is pretty small. And that's the beauty of the floating, at least the paradigm of the floating constructed wetland. They're a very small footprint, and they don't have to be one 26-foot by 26-foot. They can be the size of a dock or 2 docks, and so could be strategically placed outside of floating channels, enhancing shoreline. Again, site-specific, but I tried to give in the document you guys got on Friday the actual area that we'd be talking about, because I'm very sensitive to that.
Yep.
It's the user conflict issue is very real. And before you could say, you know, if you wanted to pursue these, the next step would be go out there and vote, make sure there's a place that wasn't going to get in somebody's way.
Yeah, and that's already a little tough to do because a lot of people have already pulled their boats at this point. I mean, a month or two ago would have been a little better indication of just how crowded those are. With the PRBs, and I think you said that we're going to get more into the specifics on these at some point in the future.
Whole workshop dedicated.
Okay, so that would be great.
Yeah.
Yes. I'll hold my questions for that one.
Noting when the makeup of this body was considered, we were looking for people with knowledge and experience in the 208 process. It's a familiarity with the topics that we were discussing here. I'm fascinated to observe that this group is not satisfied with being at 10,000 feet. They want to get right down to the wave tops on some of this stuff. So trying to reverse that trend and get back up to the higher altitude with this collection of non-traditional possibilities that are represented here, have you, as you built this, was there any assessment of, was this just to get up to the 100% compliance, or is there a safety factor in there? Some of these could go away and this end of the spectrum would still have some viability.
I noted where we had overkill in a couple of them. The rest of them are pretty much, I think there is a safety factor in the numbers, okay. Frankly, in the actual kilogram removal requirement numbers. I think there's a significant safety factor in that number. So we were just, I was doing the math to that number, except for where I'm at.
Thank you.
And at some point, as we get deeper in, we'll have the tracker. We can look really into details of all of that. So Sandy and then Judy.
The first thing is a comment, like you mentioned, ponds and lakes, or lakes and ponds in the same sentence with nitrogen. So I assume you're talking salt ponds.
Yes.
Okay. Just, we got to keep using those distinctions, I think. I have 2 questions here. One is when you mass floating constructed wetland, I know that mass is important. On the other hand, we have freshwater ponds, I should mention, as opposed to salt. I don't know, messes already that we are concerned about, but which are probably uptaking phosphorus at least. I'm just wondering, is the effectiveness of the constructed wetland just as simply the massing of its roots compared to just water lilies, say?
I think it's concentration, yes.
Concentration.
It's the concentration of the root system and the...
And the other question has to do with PRVs. How far away from the target can they be and still be effective?
They uptake, they remove nitrogen from the upstream groundwater. So there's not really, what we would do is use the watershed MVP that gives us the mass. And what you have to understand is that if you've gone so far upstream from your target terminal pond or whatever, that there are a bunch of houses after the PRV, you haven't done anything up there. That's good.
Okay, Judy?
I see aquaculture as an opportunity for additional citizen involvement, and I'm wondering if you're also going to consider having upwellers on private docks. There are areas like the river where you have the potential for upwellers there, and that would get more people engaged.
I think that shellfish, that spectrum from aquaculture to coastal habitat restoration is a toolbox unto itself. And in each, what we've done in Falmouth is looked at every watershed, watershed by watershed, coastal pond by coastal pond, and said, what blend works best here and who's interested?
Right.
Because much of it is the community that lives on this water body, identifies with this water body, and they have a particular aesthetic sense of what they want there. So I think when we get into implementation and the particulars, where shellfish is identified as wanting to be pursued, we'd absolutely think about upwellers and floating constructed wetlands next to
Right.
these docks, that kind of thing.
Because that would help with the navigational concerns, because the dock is already there. That's for people lucky enough to have one in Pleasant Bay, but there are a fair number in the river, so.
In Lonnie's, right?
John?
I think these are great solutions. How do we measure the effectiveness of these solutions going forward? We have some cluster systems here that I understand it's very difficult for the results of the effluent to be measured. How do we measure these? Are these based on pilot studies? Are they based on long-time experience?
I think there's
Just to fill that out, to clarify for me.
So the PRV, the way you measure it is you take the nitrogen concentration upstream and the nitrogen concentration downstream, and you look at the difference.
Has that been done?
It has been done for, so PRVs are a mature technology for groundwater cleanup. You know, decades of use. Have they been used for cleaning up nitrogen going into ponds? Not yet. But the same methodology for monitoring would be used. They have to monitor when they're doing other groundwater cleanup what constituents are being reduced, oxidized and reduced. And so you would use the same kind of testing. And in Falmouth, we actually put together a monitoring protocol, talking to the commission, talking to DEP, and kind of have, at least on paper, what you would measure for and what the measuring stations, how you would make sure the groundwater wasn't going around the sides of the PRV or under the PRV. So yeah, it's not that complicated. As far as the shellfish, there are a number of ways to do it that we're all doing in Falmouth. One way is to measure the meat and the shell of the shellfish that you've harvested. And I just sent samples out to BU to get the percent nitrogen in the meat and in the shell, and you know that if they've grown in that water body, that they've filtered the phytoplankton that's in the water body. We've complemented that uptake number, the nitrogen actually in the shellfish, with upstream, downstream monitoring of water quality, and been able to see phytoplankton blooms disappear as they go through the shellfish growing area. So we're working with SMAS and have quantified that, water clarity, total nitrogen as well, but you have to make sure you have a really good set of monitoring stations so that you see your gradient. But we're doing it, so yes, you monitor.
And just to say on that, that's something we can ask Paul if he's ready to talk about, or Patty, if you want to say a little bit about sort of the regional role in this long-term monitoring component of this. All right, so I've got Carol, Jeff, Alan, and Doug. So Carol?
Great, thank you. I have two comments / questions, and one follows nicely, I think, on John's question about monitoring, and that is the question of highly adaptive, that these systems being highly adaptive, because it seems to me that the ability to adapt depends on your level of confidence in performance and knowledge of what's happening. And with these, many of these being, natural systems installed in natural systems, there's so much variability, and perhaps the timeline for understanding performance is much longer than we might anticipate. I just wonder how that plays out with this notion of highly adaptive. So that's just a comment, question, kind of a philosophical observation. I don't know what it is. And then question about whether land use controls should be listed as a non-traditional tool, because some of these address sources of nitrogen, many of them don't, but certainly land use, future land use controls, it seems to me is something that should be considered as a non-traditional source tool.
Or traditional.
Or traditional. Or traditional.
On the discussion of PRBs, there has been data taken at Wacoit Bay on the PRB that's there, and is it the Childs River nearby? There's another PRB. Marine Biological Laboratory has studied the efficacy of those two, and I've been there when they have done some of the measurements.
Yeah, we have a literature, actual survey, of half a dozen where, the number of 80%, 70 to 80% removal is based on field data. So we do have real data on PRBs actually working.
There's a PRB actually operating, I think, for like 15 or 20 years now on a Schumett pond in Falmouth for phosphorus. It was done to collect the plume from the plant there. And they have a lot of data on that. It's been very successful and is functional. One of the data points.
Alan?
Yes. Each one of your scenarios had fertilizer and stormwater on the left-hand column.
Yes.
And they were all equal and everybody agreed, apparently.
Yes.
I just want to point out that, and that came from 208. As part of the work under 208, there was an assessment of fertilizer use in all the Cape towns. And Orleans is in the lowest category. Orleans is 4,000 to 10,000 pounds of fertilizer per year, as opposed to Harwich, which is 20,000 to 30,000 pounds. And so if you use the Cape Cod 208 standard, you may not be as effective in Orleans as you would be in some other towns.
Is that total fertilizer or nitrogen, those pounds?
Pounds of fertilizer. This was the Horsley-Witten study. And so I think we need to look at that specifically to Orleans. And also, you also just sort of say stormwater is 10% of the solution as well. And I'm not sure that we really understand how effective it is. As a matter of fact, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Department of Transportation, when asked about stormwater remediation for some big project in Orleans, said, we don't deal with it.
So I'm really glad you brought that up. I neglected in my preamble to discuss the fertilizer and stormwater, the 25% assumption. And we talked about this, and the reason we actually did decide to use that 25%, so there's a number from the Mass Estuaries report that says this many kilograms comes from fertilizer and this comes from stormwater. And the commission took 208, the scenario has a 25% reduction based on controls, and we took the same one. And on the fertilizer side, the reason we thought, at least at this level, it made sense was Orleans fertilizer bylaw. And it's a mirror of Falmouth's fertilizer bylaw. And since I was very involved in writing Falmouth's bylaw, I know it pretty well. And I got a call, what's today, Monday, from Scott's Lawn, the corporate headquarters of Scott's Lawn. And they wanted a database for the town of Falmouth of all the properties that are within 100 feet of our resource areas, of our estuaries, which is a prohibition in Falmouth's bylaw and in Orleans bylaw. Because they're going to cross-reference all of their customers that they have lawn care service for and make sure they don't apply any nitrogen to that 100-foot, to those properties in the 100-foot program. I mean, I almost dropped the phone. I thought it was a prank call. I was so that I had gotten a call from corporate headquarters in Scott's Lawn, and they were going to comply with our bylaw. And the guy said, yes, and Orleans has a bylaw that looks pretty close. We're going to comply with that one too. And I said, this is terrific, because as Scott's Lawn goes, the other major providers, and so I had run calculations for one of our estuaries in Falmouth as part of a targeted watershed plan, and when you multiply out all of the properties along the coast and you take a kilogram per line, which is a weighted average, which is actually a pretty conservative number from the MEP, you start to get real numbers of kilograms removed. That in combination with the blackout period and the other provisions of the bylaw, it seems like you'll actually get some reduction, and 25% didn't seem out of the ballpark. But we do want to know more about Orleans' specific fertilizer application rates, and then we may trim that down, or it may be more generous.
So just, I thank you. Also, the special town meeting on October 27th, we will be reporting that we want to take our existing fertilizer study that was done 10 years ago with SMAS to the next level.
Oh,
and
great.
look at the next 215 houses that have been built since then to see if the parameters that we used 10 years ago are still useful today.
Right, and that'll give you some really good information on what you can expect to be removing or reducing in terms of application. And the stormwater, just to be complete, the stormwater, Mike mentioned that there's a fairly comprehensive stormwater study going on, and I've talked to Falmouth's, we have a great stormwater engineer, about the BMPs and how well the leaching head stations do versus the gold standard, which are gravel, the gravel wetlands. And if you actually use the gravel wetlands and create an effective system that has a nitrification and a denitrification zone, you can get 50% or more of the nitrogen, and about the same, maybe a little less on the phosphorus, from putting in the right kind of catchment system. So a retention system that has an area where you have an oxygenated zone, but then you have a saturated zone. And DOT at Crawford Pond, which is in Falmouth, actually did put in an infiltration basin system for phosphorus, just to get rid of some of the particulates for phosphorus. But DEP standards do not recognize leaching catch basins as nitrogen removing, but there are systems that do. And I think Chatham or some of these stormwater BMP demonstrations are going to be happening soon, so we actually can quantify. But there are 40 to 90% nitrogen removal there's a BMP handbook that DEP has for stormwater. Some systems actually work, and that's what we're hoping to install.
Scott, did you want to say more about stormwater?
Yeah, I just wanted to support what Alan's saying. I'm glad to hear you're going to redo the study, because the 208 numbers for stormwater and fertilizer were general, come from general Cape-wide sources, they're a starting point. And I think it's fair to say we strongly urge towns to update those. My own feeling from looking at the numbers is they're probably low estimates. So I think if you look, you're going to find that the actual stormwater fertilizer loadings might be higher here, in which case the credits you can take are probably higher. That's just my own, we'll call it a guess at this point, but it's great that you're going to update those numbers.
Okay, Doug, and then Jim has been waiting.
With regard to measurement of the non-traditional, how do you answer the question of time to see when we see something effective or non-effective? Is there any input, guidelines, estimates?
Well, I happen to be on the monitoring subcommittee of the 208, so stay tuned. I think that's a very important question. I think where shellfish and certain other in-water solutions are concerned, you start to see water clarity improvements right away. I mean, we've seen them because of what the oysters do or what the shellfish in general do. With PRBs, you obviously have to wait until the groundwater is hit, in the same way you have to wait with sewers. You're not going to install sewers and see the change right away. You're assuming that you're going to see the groundwater clean up and then eventually not, go cleaner into the watershed. And it's a fair guess. I mean, West Falmouth Harbor is a good example. Better treatment, less nitrogen going into West Falmouth Harbor, cleaner harbor, more eelgrass. I mean, it happens. Boston Harbor is probably an even better example, right? But I think the idea is that there are certain parameters that will show up quickly, like water clarity and nitrogen concentrations in the water, that you'll be able to see sooner with the in situ than you will see with something like a sewer or a PRB. But that's why you would measure upstream and downstream, so you can see that the groundwater is cleaner. Not necessarily that the pond is cleaner, but you'll be able to see pretty quickly that once that groundwater has gone through your barrier, the concentrations are lower.
So with regard to Falmouth, you just cited, how long a time period was that?
So for shellfish, it was the same season that we were growing them. According to DEP, we were to give them 3 years of data. This is the end of our second year. And in both years, the water clarity was stunningly different. And the nitrogen numbers, I haven't seen the final report, but there's absolutely a gradient going through where we're growing the so you see some changes in the concentration of nitrogen pretty quickly. At least what we've seen so far. Where the shellfish are concerned, and with the eco-toilets, they're an immediate change, in the same way that an IA system would be an immediate change. You measure the nitrogen concentration before you install that system in the septic, in the D-box, and then you look afterwards, and we've seen, the thing that eco-toilets stunningly do is remove phosphorus. I mean, there's hardly any phosphorus left after urine. And the nitrogen numbers are also pretty good, about 80% or so removal. And you just measure that in your effluent. And as far as the PRB,
PRB again?
the permeable reactive barriers,
The time?
that we have not installed one. That is a demonstration asking to happen, really. I think that's really the next step. In other groundwater remediation, it happens quickly. And so we'd expect it to happen at the rate that the groundwater flows through that structure.
So I'm going to let Jim go, and then I'll come back to you again.
Yes, and on the first slide, you talked about PRBs, and you said that the aquifer in Orleans was maybe too thick for a PRB, but you still have PRBs up there. Is this an exception to that the aquifer is thinner in these areas, or this is just, we're talking only about non-traditional?
Okay, let me clarify what I said. That there are two kinds of installation methods for permeable reactive barriers. There are trenches, which are digging trenches and putting in wood chips or some other carbon source, and then there are wells. And so in Orleans, wells can go 100+ feet deep. So the well installation method is appropriate in town across the board. So that's what I meant, that yes, PRBs will work in Orleans, yes, they ought to be injection technology, not trenches. That's the only kind of PRB I wouldn't recommend right now in Orleans, based on what I know.
Very good. And secondly, on the Cape, has anyone successfully created an oyster reef artificially? There's only one that I know of that's natural, and that's up in Wellesley.
Sort of natural. I mean, certainly.
Yeah.
Well, they.
I mean, it's not easy to create an oyster reef. You got to have a lot of oysters.
Tons and tons and tons of culch,
Yeah.
So that was I think that was a created. I would call that a created reef. It wasn't. It didn't happen naturally because it didn't have any substrate.
It's 2 acres, and it was created. Anna Maria Frankic had a great deal to do with that.
Right.
I think last year they said they had 4 million oysters in it. They are aiming at 8 million, which is something multiples of the estimated density that the tech panel came up with. And they said Wellfleet Harbor had 100 million oysters in it 100 and some years ago. And, there's all this about risks and so on. And I wonder how all these creatures survived without us before we arrived. I mean, if these things worked for centuries, millennia, we ought to be able to do it too.
There's a book called Oysters that'll give the answer to that question. There was a lot less pollution at that time. But I want to clarify something here for everybody's benefit. And that is, we've been talking about the results of these various types of technologies. And if I understood correctly, you were talking about the results of effluent reduction or pollution reduction in sewage treatment plants or IA systems or cluster systems. You can measure the incoming and the outgoing. It's very clear, the percent reduction. It's not rocket science. It's been proven for many, many years. And we should keep that in mind, that these are proven technologies that we can determine the reduction and the effectiveness of these systems. And if they are monitored, I think good results can be obtained.
And I think that's true for some of these non-traditional as well.
So our next thing is to move to Town Cove. And I think a lot of the comments about the technologies themselves are probably similarly applicable. And as we said, the next workshop is going to be digging in even deeper on all of these. But all of this is really helpful. Do you want to say this before we go to So you want to talk about okay. So let's go to Nauset and we'll look at that one, and then we'll come back and take more time and discussion.
So Town Cove has a really ambitious reduction target. It's over 5,000 acres. So the 208 preliminary non-traditional scenario had a number of suggestions, and we also have a number.
Can you talk a little
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
So the 208 had used a number of the tools in the non-traditional toolbox, and I had to also, because the nitrogen load reduction number is so high. A main difference between the Orleans initial plan and the 208 is the permeable reactive barrier. And the 208 plan had Tonsett Road, Main Street, and 6A lined with a very large and long permeable reactive barrier. And I tried to get the most bang for the linear feet, if you will, and found that Gibson and that area of Main Street was really getting a lot of the nitrogen of per linear foot of PRB length. And so we shortened up the actual recommendation for how much PRB you put to solve the problem. That left more nitrogen to be removed, so you'll see the urine diverting and IA numbers went up, because we need more of each, because there are more kilograms left over. The other, I would say, refinement between the 208 and our, based on our field work, is in the 1980s, apparently Orleans was pulling 2 million cohogs out of Town Cove annually. It was seeded, and there was a great and effective and successful cohog program. There were reasons why the cohogs that stopped, because the propagation stopped and a whole bunch of other things happened, but from an ecosystem's carrying capacity perspective, there is resource that could be planted with cohogs that is viable, that is hospitable habitat. You know, in farming, you want to make sure you understand your soils. Well, the soils in Town Cove are good for cohogs, and that little rectangle is about a 6-acre area. Town Cove is a hundreds of acre area, and if you were to think about not confining it to this one monoculture, but instead do more of a very low density plant along between about 2 and 5 feet depth, because that's where you want to put them, that would be one suggestion for how to grow cohogs and get the nitrogen removal benefits. And that's a very conservative number. That's a big propagation program, but it's not a big number to grow in that actual water body. The other recommendations that came out of the 208 plan were a fertigation location. And there's 16 acres of playing fields at the schools. And taking, and using fertigation for those would be possible, and is, again, something I thought we wanted to take a deeper look at. And the last piece is, an addition, two other pieces, is a demonstration program in one of the schools for urine diverting toilets, because schools are great places to show this stuff off and make it an educational endeavor, and remove some significant amount of nitrogen. I think it was 500 kilograms. It was a really big number, 300 kilograms if a demonstration was done at the school. And last but not least, a little bit of floating constructed wetland to pick up the last little bit of nitrogen from. Again, this is really an extreme to try to use just non-traditional solutions in town code. And I wanted everybody to keep that in mind. This is not a recommended final plan. It was, this is what it looks like without any traditional gray infrastructure. So those are all the features that would go into it, and there's a lot of nitrogen you have to remove, so you have to do a lot of these non-traditional, natural, less pipes and engine. I mean, I'm an engineer, so this is biology, not engineering. I'm very aware of that. But I think some of the biology is pretty predictable, and so these are predictable biology, and the PRBs get you there in town code.
Comments and questions?
Yeah, just double check, I believe the town of Orleans has a policy of not using fertilizers on our ball fields or public lands. So all that green is...
61 kilograms, a couple more you got toilets.
Yeah, whatever. So I think...
Okay, that's good feedback. So fertigation would benefit us.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That's right. Not that we can't change it. That's what it's...
I'll make the same comment.
Well, this is actually kind of a Pleasant Bay-ish question, but I'm wondering if you considered fertigation for the Pleasant Bay watershed, particularly in South Orleans, where you've got the golf courses. I know they're not located in Orleans, but certainly within the watershed, and I wondered if that was considered or how that would
They
factor
are
in.
not in the sub-watersheds that I looked at. They're in Pleasant Bay LT10, I think. And Mike is going to be talking about that whole sub-watershed as an adaptive management plan because of all the questions, the break in the water quality and those issues. That's my understanding. That I didn't come up with a non-traditional scenario for that particular sub-watershed.
Yeah, I think the nitrogen credit from the ball fields and that sort of thing is fertigation, yeah?
Yeah, but you have to, the idea is that you would not be fertilizing, and so the fertilizer credit, yeah, so they're absolutely, but if they're not fertilizing.
But you're not taking credit, it's not a credit for the nitrogen taken out by the turf?
Yeah. It is, but it's also the fertilizer, well, you want to speak to that, but it's also.
Yeah, I think there'll be a partial credit there, even though the town has a policy not to put fertilizers down, which is great. But I think applying it there and let the turf grass assimilate some of that nitrogen would be a credit.
Okay.
And so you could probably figure out a partial credit for that.
The other thing is that if the MEP report in that 5,000 whatever 700 kilograms did assume fertilizer being applied to the ball fields, then the math would be very simple. You would take it off the top because the MEP included fertilizer that isn't counting.
Carol knows.
The MEP for the Nauset Estuary does not admit that the plan does not remediate Mill Pond or North Salt Pond. And I think if we get some feedback from the outside of this room, the people who live around Mill Pond will be most upset if something doesn't happen related to Mill Pond. And probably the folks in Eastham would say the same thing with Salt Pond. Mill Pond in its bottom is one of our most impaired, totally lacking in oxygen, does not register on any meter, and smells of hydrogen sulfide. So although we have tried aquaculture there, and there is a small patch of oysters in there, that pond, because of the lack of flow in and out of the mill race that was created there. I think we need to put some attention to that as a terminal pond, and I have the feeling that our friends in Eastham would say the same thing of Salt Pond.
Salt Pond has numbers. I just didn't look at them because I'm really interested.
So, you want to say that again?
Yeah, a similar concern. See, Eastham has, roughly 100 IA systems, and I don't know if they're in the greater watershed, not the sub-watershed. So I don't know whether that is useful information and whether it will help in town code. I don't know what the flow is. But also, of course, Salt Pond is very important, and I don't know how we deal with that.
Yep, I think that's an important consideration. So when I did this, I think that now's a good time to mention that I did not include any nitrogen reduction coming from Eastham. This was completely Orleans-centric. So if we were going to add a PRB, for example, there's about 800 kilograms of removal that would be part of the town code watershed, but from Eastham's perspective, for the purposes of starting, and if the group is feeding back that we want to bring Eastham into the fold, we have to talk about how to do that effectively. And Salt Pond has its own sub-watershed that is completely an Eastham issue, and we should figure out how best to handle that. And I'll put Mill Pond is in Orleans, and I saw that.
Yeah, it is.
It didn't have, you're right, it didn't have a number.
On the edge of your map.
But it didn't have it in the tracker, because the MEP doesn't have it identified, you didn't take to the next step, so we should decide how to get that on here.
Just curious, in relation to the town playing fields, have you thought of taking the water that's in Bowling Pond and using that to irrigate the turf?
No.
Just
now I have.
Just install the well there.
Yeah.
We are in the midst of installing a well for irrigation of the playing fields. The question is it drawing from the correct source, depth,
right,
correct portion of the groundwater flow?
Just, there have been several attempts to drill the well. They have been unsuccessful so far. So far.
They keep busting the drill bit.
Just not getting volume.
A couple thousand feet.
Not getting volume.
Just as Ellen commented on the credit that might be due to the town in terms of the TMDLs because of the work that's been going on to reduce fertilizer in some of the common areas, I would ask the question, what about road runoff? Because the town has been spending hundreds of thousands of dollars since those TMDLs were established in putting in catch basins and improving the quality of the water going into the pond. So, I don't know. That's just a question. Is that possible?
You don't get credits for leaching catch basins. Leaching catch basins don't give you nitrogen removal credit.
Right.
They're great for drainage, but they don't have enough residence time in the denitrification zone.
So you don't count them?
I wish.
With the credit that you were looking at and establishing for stormwater, was that 25% based on managing build-out stormwater or redevelopment stormwater, or were you actually considering retrofitting all the retrofitting existing leaching catch basins?
Yep, this was existing conditions. Okay. Good. So we're done with you? No. The next thing we're going to do is talk about the tracker. We're going to show you the screenshot that you got an unintelligible printout of. We're going to go live and show you how we used it to count some of these numbers Lou's gonna pull it up. Do you want to break first, or do you want to go through this now?
Why don't we break now? It's a natural time, and we were going to break in 5 minutes, so come back at 22.
Hi, we're going to take a couple more minutes and briefly go through a pictorial representation of the difference between the 208 preliminary scenario that was prepared by the Cape Cod Commission and their staff, and our Orleans initial non-traditional bookend. And we're just going to go through, you have these, they were provided on Friday, but the purple are the commission nitrogen removal recommendations for the different technologies. I'm sure you can read that, because I certainly can.
Yeah.
Maybe the idea is that fertilizer and stormwater is this first one, and it's the same. It's going to be the same for both sub-watershed in every case. This first one's PRB. Clearly, we have more. The commission has more PRB in Nauset Harbor than we did. Fertigation was about the same. We have more coastal habitat restoration, floating constructed wetlands, and a little less aquaculture. We had more eco-toilets and more IA septic systems. And so we're just going to flip through. If you look at your charts that I gave you, you can see what the x-axis is. The y-axis is just constant is kilograms of nitrogen. Again, here you can see a pretty big difference, and it's now back in Pleasant Bay. In areas that they had mostly they had all coastal habitat, and we had all aquaculture. Next. Is that Lonnie? Yeah, okay, so Lonnie's, again, we had a PRB, and I basically double counted floating constructed wetlands, or I belt and suspended the floating constructed wetlands. Thank you. Meeting House had some similar recommendations on a number of them. The main difference was less floating constructed wetland and a PRB. Namaquad, we were on par. Hawa had, I had, again, a PRB and less coastal habitat restoration. That was a guess. Did I read that right? And so in Pochit, we had the reef, where that wasn't identified, and that's a fairly significant difference. In Quonset, we were, again, on par. And in the lower part of the river, it's interesting, we're looking at it, I did less floating constructed wetlands and looked much more at that coastal habitat restoration aquaculture hybrid that I described, both in the upper and what you're going to see in the lower as well. Upper. Same idea. The coastal habitat restoration is smaller in the upper, and we have our floating constructed wetland in the upper as well. So those are a pictorial representation of the differences between where we started with the Orleans non-traditional and where where the bow was and where the arrow now is, as you are. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go through a brief demonstration of the tracker planning tool and show how we made these changes. So we really modified the original tracker calculations based on our own. And so I'm going to give Lou the number so you can see. So this is, why don't you describe it?
So this is a tracker, and each watershed, each major watershed has its own tracker set up for it. So this is the Nauset Harbor tracker. Within that, you have all of the sub-watersheds. We're going to focus on the Town Cove one in this demonstration. Within Town Cove, you have sub-watersheds of Town Cove again, Boland Pond, Ruth Pond, Cliff Pond, Little Cliff Pond, Baker Pond, and Higgins Pond, all that make up that area. So there's numbers that are already pre-built in to the tracker. They all come from MEP. So starting on the left, you can see in this column for Town Cove, you have the septic target. So there's a septic wastewater load. So that's the load from the septic system. So 7,652 is the kilogram load from Town Cove.
Can you zoom in just on that?
I will.
Although I'm still saying they can't see that.
Sorry about that. I have to zoom back out in order to, because some of these windows are frozen, so I apologize for it. It's a large sheet.
It's a huge data sheet.
Oops. See, things get frozen and you lose them.
That's good.
Can you see that a little bit better?
No.
No.
Even I could do that one.
All right. Zooming in.
Yeah, why don't we stick to describing what this does and not be spending our time playing around with with this. You know, unless you get up to that kind of level, you can't read any, you can't get a sense of what's going on up there.
Right.
Just remember, the point at this point is just to introduce this tool because
Yeah.
this is a tool we will be using as we go along. So for you guys to get a sense of what it contains and where it comes from and all of that.
I think the main point that we wanted to give you by showing you this is not a black box. It is far, far from a black box. You do not just take values and spit out solutions. Each one of these, and you can just highlight one of these cells are values that we are going to input. We don't take these values, we give these values. And as an example, for example, the permeable reactive barrier, there's not some magic PRB number. Lou's going to show you, we're going to go into this other tool called the Watershed MVP. So when we want to say how many kilograms a particular PRB is going to remove of nitrogen, the first thing we have to do is we have to go find on a map that's called the Watershed MVP the area that PRB is intercepting. Do you want to show that screen?
Well, let's go through this, and then I think we're going to wrap up with that, right? Or do you want to do that first?
Well, we weren't going to bother going into this at this point.
Okay.
Is that-
That's fine.
I think Jeff's point's good. This is a tool. It's a powerful tool, though. I have to say, Sia mentioned one advantage in that it's not a black box. The other is that this would take, if we were coming into this for the first time, this would take 6 months, 9 months to generate. We're coming in with a tool that is set up. We can change everything on the left, we can change everything in the middle, we can tailor it to what we need in Orleans, but it gives us a framework to work in that is very, very valuable. So that's what it is. And,
I guess, the point is, it is a spreadsheet. It's a way to keep track of where nitrogen's going. And it's been set up for us, so we can use it for our specific needs. So going into a permeable reactive barrier,
Maybe a question?
Yeah, I would like to take this home and study it, but I can't even read it here. Is there a way we could get, and I certainly can't see that there either, along what Jeff was saying, is there a way we could get this in a legible form that I could actually put on my desk and follow? It's a very interesting program. I've never seen this before, but I really want to learn about it and see how it works.
Yeah, I mean, I would say at this point, the best thing I can offer would be getting it on your screen where you can blow it up and you can actually play with it. Those who can do that, who have a screen that can do that. If you don't, I mean, the other alternative is for us to make copies that are bigger. What size copy do you have there, Carol? And is that
11 by
can you read that?
17.
11 by 17.
Yeah, that's
So
legible.
11 by 17 works.
It's a standard size in a printing shop, 11 by 17. It's not rocket science.
Stacy, can we just make copies of the model and people who want to take a copy, put it in their computer and play with it? Not that they're going to feed data back, but just to play with the model and familiarize themselves would be handier than just having a printout.
I think there might be concerns about. Huh?
I think we stay with the hard copy.
Stay with the hard copy.
Good.
Why can't we have access to the original Excel? I presume it's linked Excel spreadsheets.
Okay, yeah, so it sounds like that's something that should be done. So we will work on getting that out to everybody. And then we'll also work on getting printed copies at an 11 by 7. And just in general, to respond to the comments about materials, our suggestion is to try and find a print shop locally that we can send materials to when they're done on Friday before a meeting, and have them delivered here, and you can come and pick them up. So you can have your hard copies ready for you to look at before the meeting. And just so I have a sense, how many people would take advantage of that? It's going to be for the panel, I'm sorry to say, for the people in the back. We can have some copies here for view only, for the people in the back, but we can't make 100 copies. It's just, we'll break the bank. Yeah, liaisons at the table.
Sir Speedy.
We'll
do that. Sir Speedy would do that.
Okay.
So we'll.
All right. We will look into, that's on our action item list, and we'll make sure that happens.
Just because I heard Paul say it, and I'm sure the person who asked about getting electronic copies to quote-unquote play with, they're read-only.
They're read-only. Yeah, but it lets you. Okay, so anything else you want to say about the tracker right now?
Nope. We can just talk a little bit more about how we get the information that we put into Tracker. I think that's the next step.
But why don't we do that as we get into the more detailed assessment of each alternative next workshop?
Perfect. Okay, and we'll hold more comments about Tracker and all of that.
So we'll move straight into traditional?
No, we're going to move into Paul. Paul's presentation. So Paul is here from the Cape Cod Commission. Where is my head? From the Cape Cod Commission to talk a little bit about the 208 tools, and we're going to keep this rather concise and have him just say a little bit about the tools and the regulatory connection. You've heard a little bit about the scenarios already, and then also to answer questions.
Yes, well, thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here today, because this is exactly the kind of process that we envisioned when we were putting together the 208 process. And I sense a real sort of positive and knowledgeable vibe in the room, and I'm hopeful that this means that we're moving in a direction to get something done quickly. So, we are rolling out the plan right now, the 208 plan. The narrative is available for public comment. We're going to have our second of 4 sub-regional meetings this afternoon in Chatham. So we're out there listening, getting some feedback. And we agreed in the lower Cape that we wouldn't, at a stakeholder meeting prior to the release, put up any maps that we've generated or talk about a hybrid process we've done internally. That instead what we wanted to do is support this effort. And so I appreciate your patience in allowing us to work with you as we continue to fine-tune the 208 plan and develop the tools associated with it. That way I think we're all on the same page. I mean, the tracker is one of the tools. MVP is the biggest tool that we have, and MVP is actually a lot of different things. It is a dynamic data set that we have an increasing level of confidence in to make these important decisions on, and we invite you to get familiar with it too. MVP was constructed, and then there were other tools that we constructed, like the technology matrix that we put together, and like the tracker. And what the tracker really does is it's sort of a groundwater model. You put something on the ground, and you want to see where those particulates, which direction they flow in, and in what volumes. And that's what the tracker really does. It takes some of the algorithms developed by MEP and some of the modeling done, and it transfers it to a spreadsheet. Now what will happen is, over the next couple of months, hopefully sooner rather than later, MVP will consume the tracker. So that those calculations will be made in a graphic environment instead of a spreadsheet. so that you'll get a different kind of user interface that should be much easier to use. But the data behind it will still be transparent, available for everybody to read. And that's why I'm willing to share it with you and anyone who wants to look at it, because we want the feedback. On the technology matrix, for example, we're in our 42nd revision, and it's an example of a working information loop. You know, where we keep getting better and better information and feeding that and getting a tighter readout on how we're going to use the technology matrix. The tracker is available the same way. I will say, even internally, I only let staff look at it in a read-only format, because there can only be one editor on a spreadsheet this big. And so we would invite you all to look at it, to come back with comments, to email comments, and to participate that. And then we'll have a discussion about whether we're going to make changes, what scenarios look like, and then to the extent that there are modifications, those modifications are made through the editor, that person, that one person who has editing privileges over that fairly complex model. So it is completely transparent. We invite you to participate. We welcome your suggestions, but it would be chaos to have 50 or so people making independent changes and emailing around different versions. So that's why we're going to try to control that, just to make it more efficient. So we have the tracker that will be incorporated. The technology matrix is already incorporated into MVP. We've got MVP out there. We're also developing a financial model. I had a chance to talk to Mike Dominica yesterday. There's a financial model that is incorporated into this process, and I think it's very similar to the one that we're developing, but it is definitely a component of the sort of decision-making model, that hybrid process that we are promoting through the 208 plan. And that is one that starts with a watershed analysis by the Commission, and 2 examples of ways to meet water quality standards in each watershed. One that's really defined by a reliance on collection systems, and one that's defined by a collection strategies that are not. You know, and this is an important distinction between those kind of sewer systems that we've seen and the alternatives. But it's also an important distinction when we talk up to the regulators, because they're really more on the state and federal level concerned with source. Is it a source reduction, or is it remediation of nitrogen that's already in the groundwater? So this seems to be that sort of that crossroads that we wanted to sort of develop the tools on. And so each of those can be developed fully, and they are in the watershed reports. But that's in a very hypothetical sense. And so what's happening right now, what you're doing, is you're tailoring that information, and it was great to see SIA get up here and use the tools, and to show you their flexibility and how they can be modified and taken from that sort of regional level and modified on a local level to produce and clarify and get us to the point where we're ready to start discussing watershed scenarios. I would just say the tracker is important because where you remove nitrogen in a watershed matters. Because ultimately we're trying to affect the water quality at the sentinel stations in different parts of the estuaries and embayments. And so it's really the sub-embayment level. That's the important planning jurisdiction. And each watershed is a collection of sub-embayments for the most part. So the tracker allows us to do that. And so once you have those 2 models that are developed, you use those as sort of the edges of the discussion. And then what we'd like communities to do, which is exactly what you're doing, is you have to start with a target load in a particular watershed. We have, for those watersheds that have MEP reports, we have information on sort of the carrying capacity in the estuaries and the embayments, and the percentage reductions that were identified by MEP. We want to modify those. But a lot of part of the 208 plan was, how do we do that? We think communities should be able to get credit for things like fertilizer and stormwater mitigation plans that are town-wide and watershed-wide. And so we have discussed that with the regulatory agencies, and 25% seems to be a number that we can agree on for starting point for this. But this is such an important departure from the way the regulatory system used to work, to be able to get these sort of credits. we are moving toward watershed permitting. And that means as a community, you can get credit for nitrogen reduction efforts that you couldn't before, because they could only credit you for something that was permittable, that they had a permit for. Now we have a more comprehensive permit, a possibility in the watershed permitting that's suggested as a recommendation of the 208 plan, that will allow us to get credits, build smaller footprints. So it's an important distinction as we move forward and use the tools to develop it. So you'll take your original target load, you'll take a credit if your community has done and implemented policies that will reduce nitrogen that are jurisdiction-wide. And then you're going to add back in your local planning efforts to date. You have a CWMP. If you have identified economic development districts that you want additional capacity for, if you have failed Title V systems, if you've identified areas in your town where failed Title V systems are likely to fail, we all want that to get loaded back in, because that might adjust the load. So target load, credits for reductions, local adjustments. And really what you're going to wind up with there is what is a design load, right? This is the load that you have to remove. This is the load you're designing for. And at that point, you would mimic the traditional and non-traditional approaches, and again come up with two approaches. And the reason it's important to think through those two approaches independently is because they're going to become the boundaries of the adaptive management plan. So that once you sort of set those in place, and you've identified, based on the best available science, based on the technology matrix, that each of those has the possibility to meet water quality standards, then any permutation of combinations in the middle is also possible. And that's where you come in. On the sub-embayment level, it's a comparison, it's a discussion. But instead of arguing about whose engineering strategy is best, you're looking to define success as a community. And you're allowing both of those perspectives to play out, so that you're not discussing one engineering approach over another, that you're really discussing how do you define success as it relates to cost of whatever you're proposed, the social impact of whatever you're proposed, and the environmental effectiveness. And this is what 208 suggests as a process, and I believe this is the process that you are engaged in now. You probably don't feel like guinea pigs, but that's sort of what it is. We appreciate that. But that's the process. You know, I talked to a selectman from Falmouth who's sort of new to the board, and she's sort of new to the wastewater issue. In Wacoit, it's a big shared watershed between Mashpee and Falmouth, and they've got a significant problems. And she said, I don't know how we're going to do it. You know, Mashpee and Falmouth, we don't talk to each other. It's like kids in the schoolyard. They both think they're right. And I said, that's perfect, Sue, because what we've designed in the 208 process is a process where they can both be right. If they both meet water quality standards, they can both be right. So that's not the discussion that needs to happen in the community. The discussion that needs to happen is what's preferable. Where are the funding resources going to come for alternatives? Are you going to have to pay for systems twice if they fail? And how are you going to measure the economic impact? How are you going to measure the cost to homeowners? How are you going to measure the potential impact on the town, on the municipal budget? How are you going to impact second homeowners, year-round residents? These are the kind of discussions we have to have on a sub-embayment level in order to reach consensus on a program that we feel is going to be effective long-term. And once that watershed, those sub-embayment discussions happen, and they're collected in a watershed scenario, that watershed scenario can then be easily reflected in an adaptive management plan because you've already set the boundaries for it. And that adaptive management plan can now turn into a watershed permit. And we can do now what we couldn't do before. And so the game has really changed. And this is the difference. And this is what the 208 plan has really been about. Watching this play out for over a decade and coming to the understanding that this isn't an engineering problem. because we know how to fix it. There are any number of strategies that will remove enough nitrogen to meet water quality standards. It's not an engineering problem. It's a design problem. And that means we have to think outside of the box. And not just outside the box, we have to build a new box. And that's the sort of the new box philosophy. That's what 208 is. So that's what we're going to try to do. And that means that we have to look at solutions to this problem in more than just spatial solutions, things we do in the ground. We have to look at the cultural context that we're trying to implement this in. We have to look at the regulations that are driving us to come to the conclusions that we come to. And we have to ask if it's right for our community. And if it's not, we have to change the rules. And together, as one place, as Cape Cod, we've been very effective in doing that already through the 208 process, even though it's not complete. You know, we've changed rules and regulations. We've identified new resources of funding. And that will continue to happen. But that's what we're doing here. That's what 208 has been. It is about that design process. Because 208 is really about building a framework for collaboration to solve our greatest environmental problem and our greatest economic threat. It's not about designing optimal plans or outcomes from Barnstable Village that are going to be swallowed whole by communities. And leave no doubt, this 208 plan, the process that we've described, requires a lot of work from the local communities and a huge commitment. And that's why I'm glad that we're starting here in Orleans, where there's been so much work done, so much leadership shown, and Board of Selectmen that's willing to put the resources on the table to get the job done. So with that, I would answer any questions you would have, with one caveat, because Stacy will kill me if I don't say this, but you know, there are regulatory drivers that are driving this. We have been, if you read through the 208 recommendations, there are 4 categories. On information, we need more information. On support, we have to be more supportive. We have to work in a more supportive way with the communities. And then finance, obviously we need additional funding. We've already secured some of it. We need to secure a lot more. But then the final and the biggest category is regulatory reform, starting with me and the Cape Cod Commission, and something that you're familiar with in Orleans, because you have an approved comprehensive wastewater management plan. And so you came through with this systemic municipal plan, and we treated it like it was a supermarket. Yeah, see again. That can't happen, right? So we're going to change our regs this spring. We're going to create a new DRI process that provides more technical support, and that's what we're piloting here today. And we're going to get you through that process faster. We've already piloted some of this approach with the help of DEP in Falmouth, working on targeted watersheds. You know, if the problem is in a watershed, and that's the jurisdiction of the problem, and you have community consensus around how to move forward in that watershed, why should you have to file a town-wide plan that is speculative and rolls out over several generations in order to do that? So we've already made changes there. But most of the recommendations are for regulatory reform, so that we have rules that fit the local cultural context and the unique situation that we're presented with today, not the situation we were presented with in 1972. So we have been very successful in doing that. That is the new box mentality. But there are regulatory drivers. In exchange for that regulatory flexibility, the state and the feds expect us to get something done. And I expect that that's going to be a fairly short window. It will start over the next couple of months with a discussion about designating waste management agencies. One thing that the regulatory agencies are going to require from the Commission is that we designate a responsible party in each one of these watersheds. So that's a discussion that's going to start with the towns. Shared watersheds will be a little thorny, but other than that, I think the towns, all of whom have done some level of planning, are ready to step up and take this over. But it is my opinion that this spring, and really the latest would be this fall, will probably be the last opportunity any community has to come through on its own without significant regulatory drivers from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So it's for those who believe we can just continue to kick the can, that we can continue to raise any objection to slow the process. Those days are really behind us now. There are the enforcement and the implementation of this plan has already begun, and it's going to happen. You have a very unique opportunity to take your position on leadership in addressing this nitrogen issue and execute a plan that confirms it, that makes you the first community out of the block to use this to put in place a nitrogen management plan that's going to start the process of fixing this problem. But so that's where we're at. There will be discussions about responsibility. I think you'll see state action. I think you'll probably see a designation of nitrogen-sensitive watersheds, and the potential discussion of a creation of a water pollution abatement district for communities who don't accept the responsibility and aren't engaged in the planning. I don't feel the need to sort of expand that discussion here because Orleans is on the opposite end of that. On the opposite end of the Cape, where we're having a lot of those problems too, by the way. But that's the context. That's the enforcement issue that we're trying to place this in. But it shouldn't cloud, the positive vibe that I feel here today. What I am very confident is going to happen because I have had the opportunity to work with the town leadership over a long period of time. And if any community can get this done, it's Orleans. And given how fractured this community has been at times over this issue, it is imperative that we succeed. Because if it can happen here, we can get it done in Orleans, then every other place is possible. So I would thank you for that, your attention, and now I'll take all those really sort of thorny questions.
Yes, and I'm actually going to put a constraint on the question, because people who want to ask questions about the 208 in general, or any of those things, you have this afternoon and evening to do that. I'll be there too, and I'll listen to them then. But really now, we just want to focus on the implications for what we are doing here together now. Right? That's really, and if there's things that Paul said about that, the process that they are recommending, which is quite parallel to the one that Mike has already laid out for you, that we're doing, the tools that they're offering, and some of the regulatory information that we need to keep in mind to make sure that we're meeting the mark at the end of the day. So let me first get, if there's questions at the table. Carol and then Sims.
Paul, thank you for that overview, and I know that you and the Commission and others have worked incredibly hard to there's a monumental problem with a lot of creativity and in a way that's going to be responsive to a lot of unique conditions in various watersheds and communities. I guess the piece that I'm having difficulty reconciling with that general approach is, with your concept of design load and the assumption across the board for a 25% reduction in nitrogen attributed to fertilizer and stormwater. I think the Alliance has certainly commented on this issue in terms of our concern that maybe the efficacy of fertilizer controls is overstated, and also with respect to stormwater management and nitrogen reduction, the limitations on applying some of those technologies, given a variety of factors, land use and so forth, and the cost per pound of nitrogen removal for some of those strategies. So I guess I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, unpack that 25% and what's in that assumption, and how the cost, particularly for the stormwater component, get factored into the financial model.
So I'm not going to let him answer that, and here's why. It's a great question, and it's a good one for later today, but what we're going to do is not going to be based on this. Well, this is in our initial thing, but as Sia said, we're not just going to take that and run with it. We're going to dig down. We're going to ground truth it. We're not going to just take those numbers locally in our process. We're going to do that unpacking. So whether they do or not, we're still going to do it here. So for the purposes of this group, I'm not going to let him answer that. Sorry. I'm going to be tough here because I know we have time constraints and we could grill Paul all day.
Yeah. But there's an answer.
Good. I'll look forward to it.
I'll see if I can hit a generality that'll pass muster here. Hi, Paul. Thanks for coming to talk to us today. Thanks. And in all fairness, I already pinged DEP on this, so I'm going to ping you, and then I'm going to get two answers in the same day. You started out with a comment about balancing the distinction between source reduction and remediation. And you commented that the section on regulatory reform is voluminous. What guidance would you give us on where to head with that balancing act as we consider the appropriateness of traditional versus non-traditional solutions as we apply them in Orleans?
I wish there were a clearer answer, right? But a lot of the discussion that we've had, because we filed initially the draft with the state and the feds in June, and we talked with them about it for 60 days. And a lot of the discussion, especially on the federal level, was about the source reduction versus remediation. And you have to, when you get into the regulatory agencies, they're very siloed, right? So they look at remediation as if there's an oil tanker that flips over on a highway. What strategies would you use to remediate that oil from entering the groundwater? They happen to be, in some cases, similar to the strategies we want to use to remove methane. But they're not necessarily the same thing. Remediation, depending on the selection of technology, can be a kind of, it's certainly removal. It's not source reduction. But the question is, are there advantages to remediation? If you have growth controls in place that are adequate, could you rely more on remediation? Offsetting sort of future growth at that. Are the remediation technologies that you're looking at that are removing nitrogen from the groundwater likely to produce symptomatic benefits in the degraded water body sooner than removing a source that won't hit that for another 50 years? So it's a balancing act. And I think we have to put both of them on the table, and then we have to discuss. We have to define success, right? We're going to see a turnaround, improve water quality sooner because we're using more remediation strategies. Do we have appropriate growth controls in place so that we can use that barrier as kind of a permanent removal of existing facilities? Or are we going to collect? And if we are going to collect, what's the impact of that collection going to be on the affected water body and how soon? And then how can we stagger? Because I think the answers are going to be different in different watersheds and in different parts of the watersheds. And so that's exactly the discussion that we want to have. As far as guidance, there's a rational way to approach that. There are rational decisions to be made that could favor remediation in certain parts of watersheds and source reduction in others. If you're looking for a lot of densification, and we have this in other areas of the Cape, but I'd like to just sort of float it as an example. You're looking at increasing density around a village center or in a village center, and you also have proximate and surrounding that area a lot of single-family homes on Title V systems now. If the development that's going to come in there brings with it dense residential development and wastewater treatment that can hook up homes that are on Title V systems outside of that, you could have development with a net environmental benefit. It's not impossible, right? So we're not going to state that as a policy, but it is a possibility. And what we feel that we've done is create the tools by which we can evaluate those circumstances. And it starts to get at Carol's question, too. Because growth anywhere, random acts of density are very dangerous. And what we have done is to create tools that will show taxpayers how expensive it is to grow in the wrong places. And so that's part of that overall discussion. All those factors that were discussed earlier by Carol are put into that equation. So be rational. But I think that you can make an argument in favor of remediation under certain circumstances. I think you can make an argument for source reduction under others.
Okay. What else do you want to chime in? Okay, Lynn?
With regard to the regulatory reform concepts, what I also was curious to know whether it's largely focused at the new technologies, or is there a newer open-mindedness as well to data gathering, information gathering, and analysis? One of the things that I've been wondering about, even the minutes to our last meeting indicate that the DEP report does consider the Nauset Water Quality Report and the TMDL's final. And what I wasn't sure about is whether as time has gone forward, whether there's some new, oh gosh, we didn't think about, or maybe we should consider. And I always worry about people shutting their mind, and it's almost like the engineers for the Titanic were so convinced that it was never going to sink, and that's a hard thing for the people in the lifeboats to think about. So I wonder about whether, as time has rolled on, whether there are new data gathering techniques and some greater open-mindedness to relook at data and consider.
Well, it's a great question, and there are two, I think, important responses. And one is just about the importance of information gathering, making that available, that data available to everybody. And that, the only way we can build a new box and get more alternatives put on the table, and it's a responsible ask from the regulatory agencies, is you have to have a sustainable monitoring program. Because for each of those alternative strategies, there has to be performance monitoring. So you can see if it's removing as much nitrogen as we thought it was. And you have to have a time period for performance. And if it's not working at some point, you have to move on. And that's how the adaptive management plan works. So there has to be that sort of centralized monitoring. There have been problems with the availability of some data sets that have been used to make some of the determinations about water quality to date. That can't happen in the future. So one of the recommendations 208 plan is that there be a regional data center and a supportable and sustainable monitoring program. And I think we're fortunate that we have a viable county government that is, I believe, of enough size and scope to support that, so that it doesn't come on the backs of municipalities, but instead comes at the county level. And that information loop, performance data that we gather, that goes back into the models and then back into pilots, gets tighter and tighter, and we're going to have the best information available on this going forward. The second part is I lost. It was a really important second point, though.
The Titanic and the lifeboat?
The lifeboat, just, I was struck. You hit me right in the heart. The open-mindedness of the approach on traditionals. Yeah, that almost, open-mindedness, that was a good clue. I almost remembered it.
I think, can I try, is open-mindedness about the actual target we're trying to get to over time as new data?
Thank you. Stacy's so good to have you. The MVP data set is, as I mentioned earlier, a dynamic data set. And it's one that's continuously updated, technology, like the technology matrix is. Best information is vetted through experts and with community input. And it's put in the model, and that's used as the basis for making decisions going forward. That has to be part of that adaptive management plan. If we have better, we can't, and this drives me nuts, because in some of the federally sanctioned sort of wastewater plans that have happened nationally, sometimes they're using data sets that are 20 years old. And if you think that the land use patterns haven't changed in that 20, so we can't do that, right? We can't just set a mark in stone and say that we're not going to use data. So it has to be updated, and even some of the MEP is 10 years old now. So there has to, as a part of a monitoring program, be a way where we can continue to make improvements, right? I mean, that has a lot of common sense in it. What we won't do is stop where we are now. Because we are on a trajectory, and we vetted a lot of the information here, and it is directionally correct. We'd like the margins to get smaller and for things to get more exact as you're ever going to be with a biomass model. But we are open to suggestions on how that sort of long-term monitoring program can accept new information. We're also open on how are we going to improve MEP? How are we going to get communities better, faster, cheaper results that are up to date? And so all that's on the table, but it's not going to prevent us, especially with the adaptive management planning that's in place and some of the resourcing that's behind it, from getting plans now and moving forward.
Thank you. Brian, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that in terms of the discussion, I think, about the NASIT report last time. It's not that we were saying that the NASIT report is static, because I think we were also talking about the context of, in regard to Pleasant Bay, as we were also discussing with NASIT, how things have changed since the original report was completed, so that the actual hydrodynamic conditions have changed, which could alter, not necessarily the basic conclusion in terms of what the concentration would be, say, at a Sentinel station to establish a viable habitat, but the means by which you would go about accomplishing that. So certainly, I apologize if I gave the impression that report is static and that's cast in stone, and that's exactly what we're going to be going by moving forward. As conditions change, certainly we should be developing appropriate models within the systems to account for those changes and to come up with the best solution reflecting what the current conditions would be.
So for time, I'd love to move us on. Is there anything else pressing we need to ask Paul? Okay, well, thank you, Paul, for being here.
Thanks, Paul.
And, as everybody knows, we have Patty here at most all our meetings. We drag her along, and, and the Stantec team has been working really closely with the team over at the commission to get that transfer of information, so we really have a partner in the commission in this process. So let's move into the traditional bookend. Again, not a recommended scenario, just our starting point. And we'll hear where it came from and a little bit about it.
So as we're getting the presentation up on the screen, what a great meeting today. It's not that frequent that at meetings I really learn a lot, but I've really learned an awful lot today. So I'm really pleased to be here. My name is Steve Calabro. I work for Stantec, and my job today is to talk to you about the traditional bookend option. So Sia talked about the non-traditional bookend, and I'm trying to get my head around what bookends mean. So I'm picturing a set of books on a shelf, and they're all various options. And Sia talked about the bookend on one extreme, which is all non-traditional, and I'll be talking about the bookend on the opposite extreme, which would be all traditional. And if we solved our technical. Okay. Okay, great. So, there we go. All right. So, I'd like to start my discussion by just talking about some terms, just so we're all on the same wavelength. And the first thing I'd like to talk about is centralized versus decentralized or sort of a blend. So what you see on the left would be sort of what we would call a fully centralized system, which basically means collection of wastewater from everywhere to a centralized treatment plant where it's treated to the necessary limit and is discharged to one or more locations. Let's see if I press the right button here. The down arrow, okay. Okay. The decentralized option that we'll talk about would be maybe a major satellite system, which you sort of see in the middle. There would be, might be, okay. There would be cluster systems with satellite treatment. And there would also be on-site systems that would be part of this decentralized system. The on-site systems would generate septage. The septage would go to the major satellite treatment plant. The cluster development and the satellite treatment systems there would generate sludge. That sludge would have to be pumped out. That would go to the major satellite treatment system for processing. So that's sort of what we mean when we say, you know, fully centralized or decentralized as far as the traditional alternative goes. Okay. So when we say sewers, that can mean a host of things. First off, it can mean gravity sewers. That's the traditional concept. It can also mean pump stations and force mains because you collect at low spots and you have to pump to different locations. It can be low-pressure sewers with grinder pumps. That's used in a lot of communities. It can be vacuum sewers. It can be step or steg systems. And the general concept of sewers can be installed either open cut or it can be installed or directionally drilled. So when we say an area is sewered, we're not just talking about gravity sewers. We're talking about a host of different alternatives. And from an engineering perspective, the way we do that is once we develop an area and we say this area is going to be sewered, that goes back into the engineers, and the engineers will look at the most cost-effective way to do that. And it might be a mix of different things, but it'll accomplish getting all the wastewater to its desired location. When we talk about wastewater treatment, I just wanted to say that it can be, again, a host of different things. It can mean centralized treatment at Tri-Town, which, you know, would have maybe different discharge locations. Wastewater treatment could mean a satellite package treatment unit that handles just a cluster of maybe 20 homes or 50 homes. It could be steg treatment systems, and STE stands for septic tank effluent. Just and that's one option. And wastewater treatment can be conventional activated sludge. It can be sequential batch reactors. It can be membrane bioreactors. It can be rotating biological contactors. These are all the different processes that all come under the general heading of wastewater. And some of the smaller systems, you've probably heard of the Amphidrome treatment system is used for satellite systems. BioClear, FAST, they're sort of proprietary systems that are out there. Orenco is another system. So that's, you know, when we say wastewater treatment, those are the general categories. So the first thing we started with is the Cape Cod Commission in their 208 plan for Orleans provided a preliminary traditional scenario. And what it assumed was basically sewering of lots that were shown to meet the watershed TMDLs. That was their primary focus, was meeting the TMDLs. So on the maps that you see, the colored areas, basically, those are the complete areas that are required to get enough, treat enough nitrogen to meet the TMDLs. The actual intent, as we looked at it, is that, at least as far as we could tell, the intent was that it would incorporate satellite treatment within each watershed. That was the general assumption. And when you see the map, you'll see that they don't show Tri-Town as receiving all the wastewater in town. I think it was intended that the wastewater that's generated in a watershed or sub-watershed would be treated and disposed of in that watershed. The green areas were really intended to be effluent disposal in the watershed, and then there are some slight pink areas. Am I referring to the right ones? I'm sorry, you don't have this map, so, sorry about that. It was in the package that we put on the website, and it'll be on the next slide. And I just wanted to emphasize that the Cape Cod Tracker Program was used to determine the sewered areas to meet the TMDLs. Let's see if I can get that map up. Okay. So I'll just put a caution here. The caution is that it's a bookend. It's not a recommended plan. And I think we've said that with what SIA discussed as non-traditional. It's a starting point. So here's the map. So what you see in green is, according to the first cut of the traditional option, would all be sewered. And the intent would be the wastewater would be collected and it would be treated in that watershed/sub-watershed. And the areas that are in pink were indicated would be areas that would be sewered, but the wastewater would be treated out of the watershed, but it wasn't really clear where. So it was just a sort of a generic traditional approach.
You're looking for this map in front of you?
It's not there. You don't have it, right? So what we did was we took this, similar to what SIA did, we took the Cape Cod Commission's 208 traditional approach, and we tried to start to modify it specifically for Orleans. And that is the map that you have. Okay. So again, another reminder, it's just a preliminary scenario to be modified. It's a starting point to be modified for Orleans. Oops. Okay. So the map that you do have is our first attempt at starting to take on a traditional approach and modifying it specifically for Orleans. It's not developed to the level that SIA developed her non-traditional approach, but it does represent a bookend. So on the map that you see, the dark blue area is intended to be sewered, and it's intended to be treated at Tri-Town with a discharge location to be determined. The areas that you see in purple are areas that would be lots that would all be sewered. The treated wastewater would be disposed of in the watershed, and the purple area is the area that you would have to sewer in order to meet the TMDL if you used a traditional approach. Okay. Again, the intent was that it's based on satellite treatment within the watershed, where possible, of course, which sort of probably is the reason why the area was so large, because you're still putting some, after treatment, you would still be putting some nitrogen back into the ground, because you can't treat to zero. So that means that in order to get the total amount of nitrogen you need, you would have to expand the area. I'm going in the wrong direction, yeah. Who put this together? Okay. On that plan, you see a yellow area for Rock Harbor. And the reason why it was, the color has changed is right now Rock Harbor is proposed for a UAA reclassification. So we're acknowledging that initially that area would not be sewered.
What does that mean?
Use attainability analysis, correct.
What does that mean?
It's a adjustment of water quality designation. That can be anywhere from a variance to a designation change. It could be temporal, spatial, or parameter specific at a recognizes particular situations in water bodies, such as ones that have marinas and human uses that aren't going to be changed, to reconcile those two.
Right.
Okay.
And my understanding is we didn't make that decision to do that. Wasn't it the Board of Selectmen meeting to decide to do that? Okay, so.
He's approved within shared Rock Creek watershed.
Right, which is why we show it.
Question, if that was approved, and I understand that's in substantial debate, does that mean, what would be the implications on the traditional, is there anything have to happen from a traditional perspective if it was approved?
If it were approved, based on meetings we've had with DEP on this, it does not mean you don't do anything.
Right.
They would only approve that after all other remedies to resolve things like stormwater, fertilizer, potential sanitary surveys, everything else has to be assessed and evaluated. And then they'll consider the use change, only consider it. There's a high bar there. A use attainability analysis is a high standard, as Brian and others will point out. It's only been done in very few cases around the country. One happens to be in Boston. But it is reasonable, and there's different permutations of it. For instance, in Maine, they don't disinfect during the winter. That's a temporal variance to a requirement that reflects the fact that the rivers are frozen or they don't have the same uses they have in the summer. So that's the kind of issue that is a potential there that comes into play. Very complex. We probably should have a separate discussion of it at a different time.
So really, we don't really know, the reason why we changed the color is we don't really know what we would do there because we don't really have a TMDL we don't have a target. Right.
I'm looking at this map that was handed out, and one of the observations is, and I don't, there's no groundwater gradient or flow lines on this, so I can't tell perfectly, but in general, it looks like the up gradient portion of freshwater ponds is not sewered, but the down gradient is.
Correct.
And that's sort of curious. If we're interested in protecting freshwater ponds, I should think we'd take the stuff out, given that it was effective, okay, and there's no homes on here, so you can't
tell.
Evaluate that. But it looks like it's the wrong way around.
Well, you're right, and we had that discussion. This traditional approach is really targeted to nitrogen. It's targeted to the TMDLs. And as we take the bookends and go to the middle, the freshwater ponds would be built into a solution. In fact,
but wouldn't you take that into account in creating the bookend and say, look, we want to meet the TMDL, but we also want to protect the freshwater ponds, and sewer a different area because you can do both.
We could certainly do that, and that's a viable question. So I would just point to item 5, which is basically what we haven't done yet is we haven't taken our modifications, and that could be a very viable modification, and plugged those into the tracker and actually get some updated total nitrogen.
It's sort of disturbing that we keep, I understand nitrogen regulations and the need and the enforcement and all that. I'm not debating or pushing back against that. But we've got our blinders on for nitrogen, and we're not thinking about evaluating what can we do to improve water quality.
We hear you, Jeff. We got it. It's missing here,
Yes.
and it needs to,
Right.
Question, in the early slides, you laid out a number of different technologies.
Yes.
that could be considered sewering, and those have different levels of performance in terms of nitrogen removal.
Yes, as far as the treatment units go, yes.
Right, so in terms of the purple area, what level of treatment is assumed for that entire, did you use a single level of treatment? Did you use different levels of treatment?
Right. Yeah. It's a single level of treatment, and it's nitrogen down to 5?
5.
Yeah, it's nitrogen down to 5 milligrams per liter was the assumption.
And that's higher than centralized sewer traditionally, or I'm just curious, why did you choose 5?
5 is, the limit of technology currently for total nitrogen is considered to be 3. So 5 is, it opens up to a range of technologies that you could use. So, for example, sequencing batch reactors can hit 5, but they can't hit 3. And membrane technologies could potentially hit 3. So, but 5 is, sort of a good average number.
So back to Jeff's comments about the freshwater ponds. When we were putting together and looking at the CWMP, we recognized that soaring upgrading into the pond, you lose a little bit of your bang for the buck because the pond will remove some of the nitrogen. However, we said we don't want to sacrifice our freshwater ponds in order to clean up our saltwater estuaries. So the plan provided for soaring up gradient of all freshwater ponds.
Right.
There was a soaring system in that area to 300 feet back, which would provide about 100 years of protection to that pond from phosphates. So by doing that, you still had the pond taking out the nitrogen from the up gradient beyond 300 feet, but you gave that pond protection for about 100 years by taking it within.
You have our commitment that the next time you see this map, there'll be something on there that will address the ponds.
Judith actually made my point. From the 208 scenario building, we were looking strictly at nitrogen, and so of course we went below the ponds, so we take advantage of that natural attenuation of the pond, and therefore the sewer footprint would be less.
Well, as an adjunct to that, recalling that phosphorus and nitrogen move very differently through the soils and through the groundwater.
Right.
And I was taught the difference earlier, but for those of us that haven't reviewed that recently, they do move very differently through the soil, and that's why there are different ranges which you defend on that. But also, the point having been made when we went through the non-traditional, let's keep in mind we're still at 10,000 feet on this.
Correct, right, that is correct. Yep.
Yeah, I have one other question. This shows all the sewering to meet the TMDL being done in Orleans. And I thought 208 was going to look at a watershed. And the watershed is shared by Eastham and Orleans. And are you going to look at a watershed solution using the 208 technologies?
Yes, absolutely. This is a first step. As you know, the CWMP assumes some potential future regional cooperation with Eastham for flows that may be coming from there. That's one of the things that we need to consider. Part of the commission guidelines is that type of evaluation of systems that would serve multiple communities in the watershed. So that is part of it, yes. The other thing I make while I'm here is that the non-traditional map that you had does look at the ponds, did look at the ponds. If you look at the ponds, you'll see various non-traditional technologies upstream of the pond that we're going to be looking at. And certainly we are going to look at decentralized collection systems as well.
I just want to say one other thing about the watershed approach, and that is we have a process that's been convened as a New Orleans process, and we have liaisons from Brewster and from Eastham, and we want to honor them and take advantage of their additions here. And if we want to do some really committed planning across borders, we have to think about how we're structured and how we go about it, because we are currently not structured to, they, as far as I know, have not been given the go-ahead to make binding decisions for their town. So,
Depends who you ask.
so we just have to keep that in mind as we go, and I think it's going to be something that we're going to want to wrestle with as we go along. There might be very good reasons to look at things in more of a watershed way across town lines, and we're limited in our ability as this group to do that. Right? So we're really going to have to wrestle with that and be creative and, you know, and think about how we want to handle it as we go along.
And to add to that, the seashore, Sophia is not here today, she had another meeting, but the seashore, with its influence of the salt pond, is a very important player here that needs to be included.
So are we saying that we can expect a more detailed map than what we have before us? That would include some of the things we just said, and also going down to the legend. If we look at the two purple blocks, they're two different things.
Right.
It's hard to figure out what's where. So, you know, this map, not being overly critical compared to this map, is quite a bit weaker for us to work with. So,
Yes, we have really concentrated, since the last time we were here, we really concentrated our effort in the non-traditional. So you are correct. We're just getting started on trying to put more definition onto the traditional approach.
we have
And
So we have equal.
And yes, and I think your comment, Doug, that are you going to expect to see something different? You bet. And we're going to hear more thoughts that you have as they go to that next level of depth. What else do you want them to think about, looking at what you've got in front of you? And again, the next meeting, I think we're going to be non-traditional, so they'll have a longer period of time in the meantime to start getting this closer to
Right.
where we can really start working with it. Okay, Brian.
Given the uncertainty surrounding reclassification at Rock Harbor, it may be more appropriate to include that in the non-traditional scenarios rather than in the traditional scenarios, and then include Rock Harbor in a more traditional sense as part of the booking scenario.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, when you continue to work on the traditional map here, at what degree are you plan on drilling down so that we know what areas you're thinking on centralized, decentralized? What areas would work best with the variety of treatment options, cluster systems, and that sort of thing? Are you going to actually take this and drill down on that and not look at this, or at what point do we start to put them together? So you're doing, you know, not doing something that actually is better to do a non-traditional. So that's-
So my understanding, looking at the map, you guys saw the process map, from like, we're going to work parallel for a while. We're going to make that one better, we're going to make this one better, and we're going to do that for a while, and then we're going to do the bring them together.
So I guess what I'm saying is, for this to be meaningful, more meaningful for me, I would need to drill down into, you know, what areas are planning on doing, what kind of systems.
So, go ahead. Did you want to take one? Okay. No, so what I'll say is, right now in the office, we're doing some parallel tasks. For example, we've started site assessments. So in order to drill down a little bit more, I need to know what sites are viable in town for satellite treatment systems, for disposal of treated effluent, and so we're just studying that right now. So we couldn't really provide, you know, too much more detail because of that. We're also getting ready to do the assessment of Tri-Town, as far as, you know, what's the status of that facility. And so that would need to be built, and so we have some pieces that are missing.
Thank you.
Could you please correct the error in the legend? There are two purples, and just post that to the FTP site? That would be
Actually, it's intended to be that way, because we could not determine at this level, you know, what effluent would be disposed of in the watershed and which would not. So I know it's confusing, I apologize, but we left the same colors because right now we couldn't really determine where the effluent would go.
So is it safe to suggest then that if the two process is traditional and non-traditional are running in parallel. The traditional has quite a bit of catching up to do.
Yes, yes. Because we have some study that we're working on, like site assessments. I mean, and that's one of the reasons why the purples are the same. I couldn't really say if there was an area that would go into a different watershed because I don't know sites. That's why we made it the same. I apologize for the confusion.
I'm all set, thank you.
This is all driven supposedly by water quality, right? Addressing water quality issues?
Primarily,
Nitrogen, okay, nitrogen issues.
Right.
But if you look at the dark blue
Yes,
on the far left,
yes,
West Street and Skakey Corners and the Cape Cod 5 Bank drain into Little Namskakett, which does not have a requirement. So that part of the dark blue would not be a water quality issue,
right.
right?
Correct.
So this is
The
an allocation.
dark blue is, you want to go back to that? It shows
No, I know what,
the dark
You know
blue is
what
for.
it is.
I know what it is, but what I'm saying is, that section is not driven by a water quality issue. So it
Right.
gets into the allocation of who pays for that particular section of the, if you do it.
Right.
Okay? The same would apply to the wedge that goes into Cedar Pond, the way you laid this out, since you're not doing something up gradient of Cedar Pond.
Right.
And it would apply if there's a variance or something on Rock Harbor, if that, then that's not a water quality issue. And by the way, I have gone through a lot of the water quality data issues that we have up to date, and I cannot see an effect of Cedar Pond drainage on the boat basin. But further, if you look at this yellow area,
Yes.
and I can't tell what the streamlines are for the groundwater flow, a lot of it is going right into the marsh. And that's where it's supposed to go. So I'm not sure how much of this light yellow is causing problems in the boat basin. So there are a lot of issues, and I have sent to Mike some materials on this, which but I just raised that issue.
Just a comment on that, Paul. The actual border, as we've talked about on 10, and the decisions there, we have to spend a lot of time on. Water quality is the driver of the whole thing. The water quality is the driver. However, as Paul said, there's other goals here that need to be taken into account. One of the things we're doing in the utility survey is actually looking specifically at these larger downtown systems to see a variety of different things, not only spatially what they look like in their hydraulics and plumbing, but their age, the type of systems they are, how well they've been maintained, et cetera, to try to determine where that boundary is, where if there is a traditional solution, it seems silly to pass by a major contributor just because they're outside that line. So those lines can all be adjusted, but we want to get more data before we actually get
I think the issue is who pays.
That's exactly
That's
right.
the allocation
One of the
issue.
things we're looking at in the model is a much more robust evaluation of that, a lot more definition of what the revenue sources are, and a variety of other things regarding who pays, and how much, and when. So, that's a good comment.
Are there anything else on the traditional bookend?
Right. So talking about the non-traditional approach and the traditional approach, and eventually coming to something in the middle, and then, once you get to that, applying adaptive management practices, basically leads into, Mike wanted to discuss some adaptive management.
Just at the risk of repeating, we're going to get a more detailed, drilled down, all the terms we've heard, map, and this will be on the agenda next time?
Not next time. We're going parallel. We'll talk a little bit about how we're going to go, but in order to dig in, we are going to have some meetings that are just looking in-depth at non-traditional technologies, and some that'll look more in-depth on all of these things. So they might not all happen at the next meeting. They're not going to all happen at the next meeting, but they are all part of this path. So Mike can also talk a little bit about the scheduling.
Yeah, we've, just while we're right on that topic, we've looked at, we are frankly very fortunate to have Sia on the team. Sia's been doing this stuff for non-traditional technologies in Falmouth for the last 2 years, so she comes to this with a big head start on these technologies, so that is good. What we would like to do is next time focus on getting into the details of the non-traditionals and have a summary of the financial approach that the FinCom, Joshua Larson and Doug Gardner are here, and Stantec are meeting on this afternoon to start framing that out and how that's going to look. So that'll be part of next workshop, as well as drilling down into the non-traditional technologies in more detail. The 22nd of October will be focused on the details of the traditional alternatives. As Steve indicated, there's a lot of pieces to that are being put together there. The ponds are not being overlooked. They are, in my opinion and our team's opinion, very, very important. And if you look at the non-traditional map, you'll see that we do have non-traditional technologies up gradient of the ponds. It wasn't meant to be left off the sewering alternative. That will be taken care of, but that is a very, very critical component of this. Any other questions on traditional?
Mike, one question. I'm not sure I understand what we're asking in terms of the Rock Harbor area. I'm a little confused as to whether we're going to just leave it as a question mark, whether we're going to assume, so I'm not sure where we've settled on that. So what are we asking, what should we expect in terms of Rock Harbor when we go for the traditional?
Well, CWMP had basically
No, I just don't know what the decision is, because right now what we're saying is we're not addressing it.
Well, not quite. We're saying we would do a number of different things in terms of monitoring, stormwater management, fertilizer control, possibly sanitary surveys, possibly other watershed management things that need to be done there, but not sewered. And not included in the traditional approach, technology. What Brian's saying, and I think it's a good comment to consider, is consider it under a non-traditional. Now, there are things that can be done there with INA systems for failing systems, or say, for instance, you have a Community of Jesus facility. I don't know details of it, but if that needs to be replaced, what should we be looking at? Are there things like that that can be done? You smile, do you know?
No.
As part of watershed management under a non-traditional approach that could take longer time and give the use attainability analysis time to see if that's going to be a viable solution or not.
If you go back and look at the CWMP, there were a number of usage issues in that area because you have very high groundwater levels. So you already have septic systems that are above ground. So I think that's another thing that you need to look at as you're looking at this traditional versus non-traditional, is where groundwater level is.
Good point. And you know, there's still some, I think, some questions on the marsh. Generally, marshes are nitrogen sinks. They tend to take up nitrogen. And in general, my remembrance of the Rock Harbor Creek MEP study was that marsh is healthy. There's been work done on diaprints and other places to hydraulics and stuff like that, but the marsh is healthy. So I think we have time, as Brian's suggesting, look at adaptive management, look at making some progress and doing what we can do, but and that's what you'll see in the next group of slides here, but not plan it to be part of a traditional sewer system.
Mike, where in the process do you think we would discuss the design load questions, you know, in terms of stormwater and fertilizer? The 25% reduction.
Good question. I think that's something I have several places in my notes, is to drill down on that. We were talking about that at the break. And we do need a mass balance on that. And I like to think in graphics. What did the 208 assume? What were the sources? What are their assumptions about removals? And how does that compare to Orleans practices already, both in terms of the fertilizer survey, which will provide more site-specific data on the actual practices, and the implications of the bylaw, which also impact Orleans as well. And how does that compare to the assumptions from the MEP? And that's something that's on our list to do.
Just to clarify, I think what I meant was looking at non-traditional approaches, of which reclassification would be one, would be, where I was suggesting that may be moved, and that you would still include Rock Harbor at a traditional means of addressing the identified issues from the MEP report in Rock Harbor through the traditional, in the traditional bookend, not ignoring.
So you're saying keep the sewering on the table?
Yeah. That would be my suggestion.
Speaking in support of that, the use attainment analysis is not a hall pass. It's an analysis of the efficacy of the efforts. And if the most intense effort isn't going to achieve the intended water quality, then to what degree do the efforts back down? Correct me if I'm missing anything here, Brian. But as we go through it, that's the pitch that we would make to DEP. The pitch is not skip it. It's what's a reasonable effort for a reasonable return in terms of improved water quality. So we still have to demonstrate that we're going to do the things that have a positive impact.
That's true. I think someone mentioned earlier competing uses. I think that's a significant factor here. When you have human uses that conflict with the water quality uses, that's one of the criteria. There's 6 criteria in the Clean Water Act for use standards change. Several of them could apply to Rock Harbor Creek.
And the bathymetry of it is...
Yeah, some of them are natural, some are anthropogenic.
And Mike, not to disagree with my colleague much, but I think basically, we can't call it a hall pass, but I think that the discussion that we had at the joint meeting of the East End Board of Selectmen and the Orleans Board of Selectmen, where you and Andrew Godley made the presentation, did go through those 6 particular issues you're talking about, and it was very clear that if anything, if anybody could be appropriate for a use attainment analysis and reclassification, this was the body for it. And so I think importantly there was a unanimous agreement to move ahead and work with our regulatory authorities to get this done. And I think that that it should not be in the traditional analysis, because it was very clear this is what we wanted to do. If there's a roadblock a little further down the road, that's something we'll have to address. But this was well discussed and well understood, and I would not have it in our tradition.
Just not to be left out. If the other two were here, we're unanimous on how to proceed. But let me just add something that I think we need to throw in the mix here. Paul Niswicki was here, and he gave a very nice presentation. And one of the terms that he used was nitrogen-sensitive watersheds. And then he talked about future enforcement from state regulators. And having heard Paul talk before, that might get to the point in the next year or two, if there is a failed system in a nitrogen-sensitive watershed, which Rock Harbor is, then the owner of that failed system might be required under regulatory to put in an IA system to remove the nitrogen that comes from their home. So I understand we can debate whether Rock Harbor is in or out, The fact is, this is an issue that's been going on for 15 years, and Rock Harbor was in phase 4 because nobody could really make the decision on how to proceed. But I think we cannot forget the fact that we have a TMDL for Rock Harbor.
Yeah.
And I support the use attainment and everything like that, but there's some factual things here that we
Yes.
have to keep on the table.
Yeah. And I think, as you'll see in a minute, I have some slides here on adaptive management. Rock Harbor is one of those that falls into that category. As I said before, a use attainment analysis and a modification of standards can be a variety of different things. It can be spatial, in other words, for a certain segment of a creek, just for that segment. It can be temporal for a certain time of year, or it can be parameter specific, just for nitrogen. Doesn't mean you don't have to solve the bacteria issue, clarity issue, depth, other things. So it's not a hall pass in that regard. Those are, there could also be a variance. It could also put in place, as has been done relatively frequently, a variance that says we don't know enough yet, and we need to make decisions more for the long term.
I want to move us along
Yeah.
for time purposes, because we're getting late. So Mike, can you?
Okay, let me go through this relatively quickly, but you'll notice that in the traditional, non-traditional bookends that you've seen, there's been a focus on Pleasant Bay and its terminal ponds, terminal salt ponds, and Nauset, and its especially Town Cove. What we haven't discussed is Namskakett, Little Namskakett, Rock Harbor Creek, and Nauset Marsh in general, and the main part of Pleasant Bay. You'll see big triangles on your maps there. And what we're thinking at this point, and again, these are straw men. They're not, except for Rock Harbor Creek, which we've just talked about. Pleasant Bay and Nauset are nitrogen sensitive. The other, Little Namskakett are not designated as nitrogen sensitive yet. What I'd like to go through here is a preliminary straw man proposal on each one that would classify these in an adaptive management framework that says we know some things that need to be done. We need to collect more information and assess more carefully what the stressors are, what the causes of impairment are, and what the solutions might be. So, for instance, for Nauset Marsh, continued, and these include a variety of things that would be in a plan. And again, this is first cut. What I'm going to ask is that these will be put on the website, and for your comments on them over the next, probably over the next month, 2 months, actually, we'll be working on these and adjusting them. But for Nauset Marsh, and I distinguish that from Town Cove, that you guys may disagree with that, but I think there's a distinction between the marsh, Town Cove, and Mill Pond, and I think we need to look at them somewhat differently. But for the marsh itself, continued modified water quality modeling in the marsh and Town Cove. The parameters, the frequency may need to be adjusted, but continued monitoring. Integrated water quality data update for MEP remodeling. As Paul mentioned, the MEP is not a static analysis. Things do change. There's been questions there. There's changes in the hydrodynamics of that estuary. There's been, we have enough, I believe, this is my own opinion, to move forward in Town Cove. There's other parts of it that we need to look at more carefully, and I think we need to look at the data collection, additional data collection that is integrated with the MEP requirements to calibrate and run the model. Independent review and rerun of the MEP models. Not because they're wrong, but because they need to be updated, they need to be confirmed. We're at a point now where we're going to make significant decisions about these things, and we owe it, I think, to ourselves to take more recent data, rerun the models, and have an independent party look over this and give us a perspective from expert in the industry. Sensitivity analysis, both the ASA recommended sensitivity analysis. Brian Howes would like to do sensitivity analysis. His sensitivity analysis done in the MEP studies before was not on the actual input criteria itself. It was on sensitivity to different other variables other than the nitrogen, actual nitrogen concentration. He had to do that because TMDLs can't give you a range. They can't say, well, you can remove somewhere between 50 and 75%. He needed a number, so he puts a number in. But there's uncertainty in that model. All models have uncertainty. Someone once said to me that no one believes the results of field sample data collection except the person that takes them. Everyone believes the result of computer simulations except the guy that makes them. And there's some truth to that. These are complex models. We need to look at them carefully as we go forward. Piloting of non-traditional technologies in other watershed, cooperation with Eastham on a watershed plan. But that's preliminary straw man for Nauset Marsh. Pleasant Bay, continued water quality monitoring of the bay and salt ponds. Same thing for MEP. Integrate the water quality testing that's being done with a systematic plan that has MEP input to it. The stuff that's being done is good. It's helpful to have data, good QAPPs, good information, but it needs to be looked at from the point of view of remodeling and what the requirements there are. Otherwise, it wouldn't pass muster. An expert comes in from the outside and says, well, you just have limited data there. It needs to be systematically looked at. Sensitivity analysis, again, we need to look at that with a range of hydrodynamic conditions there and see what the sensitivity is to nitrogen. I think we get stuck in the syndrome of it's all or nothing because we don't know specifically what it is. We do all or nothing. And that's not the case. We could come out with a range not 74.68%, but it could be somewhere between 50 and 80%. That gives us enough to know that we need to do something to move forward in an adaptive way. Piloting of technologies, again, in terminal ponds. Expansion of the current aquaculture and shellfish program. There's a desire in the town, at least by the harbor master and shellfish warden, that more can be done. That it's limited now by constraints that are somewhat artificial and could change. And that's something that could be looked at in terms of an adaptive plan going forward for the major part of Pleasant Bay. And again, cooperation with the other towns. Namskaken. Termination of discharge from Tri-Town Septic Treatment Facility. Monitoring and stormwater remediation upstream of Hurley's Bog in Route 6A area, upstream of the culvert, the new culvert, and the old culvert. That's got some challenges with DOT, but it's an area of town you look at and you say, okay, what are we going to do there going forward? Continued monitoring of vegetation restoration at Hurley's Bog culvert. APCC is doing that. There's budget issues, but that should continue to see what the impacts of that are. Verification of the hydraulics of that to see how it compares to natural conditions. It may be enough to prevent flooding upstream, closed enough to prevent flooding, enough to let some tidal flow up there. But what is it compared to natural conditions, and is that sufficient to restore the vegetation? Development of a long-term goals for Route 6 area. This seems to me, and this may be more of a suggestion as a consultant, we could certainly focus on a particular pond or a particular culvert or particular this or particular that. But there needs to be a bigger vision for this that looks at it more long-term. What do we want to do with land use up there? What do we want to do with the properties as they change hands? What do we want to do with the DPW facility? What's the vision of this that then we can say, okay, restoration of this pond or this area is part of a bigger picture? And then have that framework as a guide going forward, not just jump after the first thing that comes along, run out taking samples and say, we're going to do this with it, before we see how it fits with the whole picture. Update of vegetation survey and development of a vegetation management plan. A lot of the field trip and the workshop we had a few weeks ago, it was focused not just on the freshwater discharge from the plant, but there's impacts on the vegetation throughout the marsh. It's spotty. It looks like it's related in some cases to site-specific kind of issues. Other places are not quite sure what it is. It could be related to freshwater. They don't know. However, Phragmites is very invasive, and they're saying it will spread. So some kind of plan to understand what it was, what it is now, and what we want it to be and protect going forward seems to be in order. Continued water quality modeling at selected locations in cooperation with Brewster, of course, on these activities. Little Namskakett, termination of discharge from the Tri-Town Septic Treatment Facility. I don't know what impact that has or not, but there is some impact there. That's going to happen. Development and implementation of stormwater management plan. All of these really have stormwater management as part of them. We have, in Orleans, you have a good inventory to start with, and there's some activities that are being undertaken, both for quantity primarily and some for quality. But it needs to be extended to look at it as part of a 208 or revised CWMP water resources management plan for quality and quantity together. Continued water quality monitoring at selected locations. I think a relook of the locations, parameters, and frequency again is warranted. Environmental assessment of marsh and watershed. Maybe there's been more work done on Little Namskakett than I know about. I don't know. It's still a black box to me, frankly. How is its health? Has there been really, like, have you taken it to the doctor and said, how is this marsh doing? What are the stressors? Is it where we want it to be? Do we need to protect it? Is there things that we need to be? I don't know if we know that. Maybe you do. Again, straw men and open for comments. Rock Harbor, development and implementation of stormwater management plan, implementation of the Cedar Pond recommendations, resolution of the cormorant problem, continued water quality monitoring at selected locations. Again, we need to look at that. If we're looking toward a UAA, monitoring is going to be critical. Not just at one location or two locations to measure one or two parameters. We need to understand what's happening throughout the marsh for a variety of different reasons. Pursuit of water quality standards adjustment to reflect marina and natural causes of non-attainment in cooperation with Eastham. I think that's it. So those are placeholders for adaptive management for those watersheds that will have cost implications, and there will be adjustment of the tasks and what we think is appropriate, but also each one of those will have a cost and a schedule associated with it, with the link it with the rest of the plan. So.
Okay, so we're out of time, and I have to take public comments, and I apologize that we're over our time. I won't let Mike do it again.
Are we?
You can't comment on adaptive management now. However, you will have, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you guys a reminder before the end of the week. I'm going to, ask for comments on the draft meeting summary from the last meeting so that I can finalize that. I'll remind you of that. 2, I'm going to ask you your thoughts on outreach and public engagement, and I'm going to put that at the beginning of the next agenda so it doesn't drop off at the end. 3, your comments, in particular, any additional thoughts you have on the non-traditional, because SIA is going to be working really hard over the next 2 weeks to get us ready to talk about that at the next meeting. And then fourth, any other additional comments that I'm not letting you make now because we're out of time. So, but I do want to honor our promise to, though we did take public comment as we went, I do want to just open it for public comment. Please be on task, focused on what we've been discussing, these initial scenarios. And please also follow the other ground rules. Yes, Jim?
I think it's very important, Stacy, when we start considering the public outreach, that we start considering beginning public outreach very soon, because there's a lot of complexity in this, and without the public understanding that, you get plenty of opportunities for this to fail. A large reason that the CWMP failed, not the only reason, but a large reason, was the complexity of it. It was not sold properly. It was sudden sticker shock certainly compounded that. We need to begin an actual ongoing program, maybe a weekly column in the newspaper, I don't know.
So, thank you for that. And that's why I promise I'll put it at the top of the agenda next time. And I want your ideas in advance, so ideas like that, send them to me, and I'm going to compile them and get us started with that conversation. Any other public comments for today? I'd like to honor our commitments to be done on time, so even though we feel rushed here at the end, it's a respect for your time.
Betsy, now the next meeting is going to be in the afternoon?
Next meeting is in the afternoon.
And that's because of water quality stuff, or water quality
There's
testing?
another meeting that's taking place in the morning.
There's another meeting?
Yes. That's, I believe, there was a third Wednesday.
There was a conflict in this room, and
On the 8th?
1 o'clock.
On the 8th.
On the 8th of October.
8th of October, so 2 weeks. It's going to be 1 to 5 instead of 8:30 to 12:30.
The Water Protection Collaborative meeting.
So it's Water Protection Collaborative? Should I need to explain that to somebody who's not pleased that we're going to be taking over the room at that time? Okay, thank you.
So David, I'll turn it over
I
to you.
I think we're open to adjourn the meeting, so may I have
So
a
moved.
motion? Second. All in favor? Aye. Thank you all.